Welcome, friend, to another trip we take together. We're so happy to have you here. Tonight, you will find out about old wisdom that has been quietly shared by wise teachers for a long time, who found the secret ways to have inner quiet and deep rest. If you want, feel free to share what time it is and where you are listening from. I'm going to share a carefully chosen group of old Zen stories that hold the forgotten secrets of having a clear mind and feeling free from bad emotions. Each story has a powerful lesson inside it that can totally change how you deal with worrying, getting frustrated, the never-ending chatter in your mind, and that constant feeling of wanting something more. These aren't just simple tales for passing time. They're carefully protected lessons from very wise people who understood something that most of us miss, that being peaceful doesn't come from changing the outside world, but from completely changing how we deal with it. As Lao Tzu said, at the center of your heart, you have the answer. You know who you are and you know what you want. Throughout our time together, you'll find out exactly how these lost teachings can make your inner feelings much better. As we explore these amazing stories, you'll start to notice something great happen. The heavy feeling of being worried will start to disappear. The constant stream of thoughts will naturally begin to calm down. You'll find yourself easily moving into a place of deep understanding and calm rest. So let yourself completely settle now. Let your whole body melt into whatever is holding you up. Join me for one deep breath, and as you let it out, trust that you're about to receive wisdom that has been patiently waiting for this very moment. Let us now explore a story about the deep meaning of helping others without wanting anything back. In the mountains of ancient Japan, where mist hung to pine trees and prayer flags waved in the mountain wind, there lived a Zen master whose reputation for wisdom had spread everywhere. Yet this master, even with his great learning and the people who traveled far to find him, spent his days doing what seemed to be the simplest of tasks, weaving straw sandals. Each morning, as the sun painted the mountain tops gold, the master would gather dry grass and begin his quiet work. His old, rough hands moved with practiced grace, making pair after pair of plain footwear. The sandals were not fancy or beautiful in the usual way, but they were strong and comfortable, made with careful attention to every detail. When several pairs were finished, the master would walk down the twisty mountain path to where it met the main road used by travelers, merchants, and people on religious trips. There, on a large, flat stone, worn smooth by countless years of weather, he would place his sandals and quietly return to his temple. He never waited to see who might take them. He never looked for praise or payment. He never even left a sign explaining why they were there. One day, a young monk full of big dreams of becoming enlightened went up to his master with barely hidden frustration. The student had been watching this daily habit for weeks, getting more and more confused by what he thought was wasted talent. His face was red with honest concern. He finally found the courage to speak. "Master," he said, his voice tight with confusion, "I don't understand. You have such deep wisdom, such great understanding of the Buddhist law. Hundreds of people would travel here just to hear you teach. You could give great speeches, lead quiet meditation times, write explanations of the holy books. Why do you spend your valuable time making simple sandals when you could be changing so many lives with your words?" The master's hands never stopped in their weaving as he listened to his student's strong plea. When the young monk finished speaking, the master looked up briefly, his eyes sparkling with gentle fun and endless kindness. Then, returning his attention to the straw in his hands, he spoke in a voice as soft as mountain mist. "The path to enlightenment is long, and the stones underfoot are sharp," he said simply. "Making the journey easier for another is the teaching." As the Buddha observed, thousands of candles can be lit from a single candle, and the life of the original candle will not get shorter. Happiness never gets smaller by being shared. The main point of this lesson is understanding that true spiritual teaching often happens not through big, fancy actions or clever words, but through simple acts of kindness that lessen pain wherever we see it. Why do we so often ignore quiet acts of kindness in favor of more dramatic ways of showing wisdom? Zen Buddhism points out that our trained minds prefer things that are spectacular over things that are quiet, things that are easy to see over things that are invisible, things that are praised over things that are anonymous. We live in a culture that values being noticed, having a lot of followers, and making a difference that can be measured. Yet the deepest spiritual truths often show up in ways that cannot be counted or made public. The Master's sandals stand for what Buddhist teacher Joseph Goldstein calls the wisdom of small kindnesses. Each pair placed silently on that stone was a lesson more important than any speech. They proved that enlightenment is not separate from kindness, that wisdom without helping others is incomplete, and that the highest spiritual achievement is often exactly the same as the most ordinary human kindness. Think about how we usually measure spiritual progress or a helpful contribution. We count students taught, books written, retreats led, likes received, or lives that were greatly changed. But the Master understood something deeper, that preventing a single blister on a traveler's foot, offering comfort to one tired person, or simply showing selfless service might plant seeds of awakening that grow in ways he would never see or know. In our modern lives, we get countless chances to practice this same wisdom. The co-worker struggling with a heavy project, the elderly neighbor who could use help with groceries, the stranger who drops their papers in the wind, the friend going through a difficult time who needs nothing more than a listening ear. These moments rarely feel important, yet they offer us chances to live out the Master's teaching. Zen teacher Charlotte Joko Beck reminds us, practice is not about having special experiences, but about how we meet the experiences we're having. The Master met each day with the question, how can I help? His answer came not from big plans or careful thinking, but from noticing what was needed and offering what he could give. The sandals also teach us about the connection between our spiritual practice and our daily actions. Many people who seek spiritual truth create false separations between spiritual time spent in quiet thought or study and ordinary time spent in work or helping others. But the Master's life showed that there is no such separation. His weaving was his meditation. His service was his teaching. His daily routine was his spiritual practice. Thich Nhat Hanh taught the most precious gift we can offer others is our presence. The Master offered his presence not just to the formal students who came looking for wisdom, but to unknown travelers who would never know the name of the person who helped them. This anonymous kindness represents the purest form of giving, free from any hope of return or praise. Tonight, as you think about your own path and purpose, can you figure out the simple sandals you might weave? Perhaps it's the encouraging word you offer to someone feeling discouraged, the patient listening you give to someone who needs to be heard, or the small caring gesture that brightens another's difficult day. These actions may seem small compared to bigger dreams, but they carry the same powerful change as the Master's humble footwear. The Buddha taught, in the end, just three things matter: how much you loved, how gently you lived, and how gracefully you let go of things not meant for you. The Master who made sandals showed all three, loving through service, living gently without looking for praise, and letting go of the ego's desire for big, dramatic results. In his quiet daily habit, he showed that the highest teaching is often found in the simplest offering of what others need. As we continue our trip through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, we find a deep lesson about the true meaning of thankfulness and kindness. The gate of a mountain temple had gone through many seasons, its wooden frame now drooping with age and wear. The paint had faded, the hinges made loud creaking sounds with rust, and several boards hung loose in their fittings. Realizing that the entrance to their holy space needed attention, the abbot decided to hire a local carpenter to build a replacement. The carpenter who answered the call was known throughout the village more for his cheap prices than his good work. He arrived at the temple with a grouchy look and an air of being annoyed, as if the very act of working was a bother. From the beginning, his way of doing the project showed his attitude. He chose the cheapest wood available, much of it wet and likely to twist. His measuring was careless, resulting in connections that had gaps and corners that didn't line up right. As the days passed, the monks watched with growing worry as their new gate took shape. The carpenter's lack of attention to detail became more and more clear. He left gaps between boards that would let in wind and rain, used weak metal parts that would surely break under regular use, and hung the whole structure at a noticeable angle that made it difficult to open and close smoothly. When the work was finally said to be complete, the abbot came to look at the results. He stood before the crooked, poorly built gate for a long moment, his eyes taking in every flaw and mistake. The carpenter waited nearby, his expression challenging and defensive, as if daring anyone to criticize his work. The watching monks held their breath, expecting their teacher to point out the clear problems and demand better work. Instead, the abbot reached into his robes and pulled out the full payment they had agreed upon. But he didn't stop there. To everyone's surprise, he added a substantial extra amount to the sum and gave it to the startled carpenter with a deep, respectful bow. "Thank you for your excellent work," the abbot said with genuine warmth in his voice. "This gate will serve our temple for a long time. Your efforts are deeply appreciated." The carpenter stood frozen, clearly not ready for this response. He accepted the payment with clear confusion, mumbled a barely heard thank you, and hurried away with his tools as quickly as possible. As soon as the carpenter disappeared from view, the younger monks crowded around their teacher with confused questions. "Master," one exclaimed, his voice filled with upset, "that man cheated you. His work is terrible and he knows it. Why did you praise him and give him extra money? This encourages dishonesty and poor work." The abbot looked at his students with patient understanding, seeing their confusion as a chance to teach. "His poor work is his own business," he replied calmly. "Perhaps he is troubled in his personal life, or perhaps he lacks the skills he wishes he possessed, or perhaps he is simply going through a difficult period. Whatever the reason, that is his problem to work through. But my response to his effort, however flawed it may be, is my business entirely." He paused, allowing his words to settle before continuing. "I have planted a seed of unexpected kindness in him. How he takes care of that seed, whether he allows it to grow into greater care for his work or ignores it completely, is his affair. But my part in this exchange is complete. I have chosen to respond with thankfulness rather than criticism, with generosity rather than judging. Buddha's wisdom reminds us hatred does not stop by hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal rule." This ancient wisdom clearly shows the deep truth in the abbot's response to poor work. The teaching shows that how we react to others' mistakes often says more about our own spiritual state than about their behavior. Why do we find it so hard to respond to disappointment with kindness? Zen Buddhism points to several deep habits in our trained minds. First is our attachment to outcomes, the way we suffer when what happens doesn't match what we expected. We get focused on having things done correctly based on our rules, forgetting that our rules themselves are simply preferences, not universal truths. Second is our habit of making others responsible for our emotional states. When someone disappoints us with their work, behavior, or attitude, we often give them the power to decide our inner peace. The abbot stayed calm, not because the gate was well built, but because he understood that his peace of mind was his own responsibility. Third is our tendency toward judging and punishing. The mind automatically puts things into categories like good or bad, deserved or undeserved, worthy or unworthy. This mental habit creates a world of constant evaluation, where every interaction becomes a test that others must pass to earn our approval or kindness. Think about how often throughout your day you get chances to practice the abbot's wisdom. The server who gets your order wrong, the driver who cuts you off in traffic, the colleague who misses an important deadline, the friend who forgets to return your call. Each situation offers a choice: respond from judging and irritation, or respond from understanding and kindness. Zen teacher Jack Cornfield reminds us, "The heart that gives gathers." The abbot's generous response to poor workmanship shows this idea perfectly. Rather than collecting resentment, frustration, and the carpenter's defensive energy, he gathered the satisfaction of keeping his own integrity and the possibility that his kindness might inspire change in another. The deeper lesson here shows us that true generosity is not conditional on getting quality in return. It comes from an understanding that every person we meet is struggling with something we cannot see. The carpenter's poor work might have come from family troubles, financial stress, health worries, or simply a lack of proper training. The abbot's response honored the man's basic humanity, no matter his current ability to do things well. This story also shows the difference between enabling bad behavior and compassion. Some might say that paying the carpenter in full plus an extra amount rewards poor work and encourages continued carelessness. But the abbot understood a subtler truth. Genuine kindness often plants seeds that take time to grow. His unexpected generosity created a moment of surprise for the carpenter, a crack in his defensive shell where new awareness might enter. Vietnamese Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh taught, "Understanding is love's other name." The abbot's response showed understanding that the carpenter was probably doing his best within his current limits. This understanding allowed love to flow naturally, creating space for change rather than resistance. In our culture that focuses on results, we often find it hard to offer appreciation for effort rather than just results. We hold back praise, payment, or recognition until others meet our rules. But the abbot's wisdom suggests a different way, noticing the attempt itself, honoring the willingness to try, and trusting that kindness has its own power to change things. Tonight, as you think about a recent disappointment or frustration with someone's performance, can you find the seed of unexpected kindness within your response? Perhaps it's offering encouragement instead of criticism, expressing thankfulness for their effort despite imperfect results, or simply keeping your own inner peace regardless of their actions. As the Buddha taught in a famous story, the moment we feel anger, we have already stopped trying for the truth and have begun striving for ourselves. The abbot who paid the carpenter with an extra amount showed that keeping our promise to be kind is more important than being right. That our spiritual practice is measured not by others' performance, but by our own response to their imperfections. Let us now turn to a tale that shows the delicate balance between being very organized and being complete. In a temple nestled among rolling hills where cherry blossoms danced in the spring breeze, a young monk was given a task that filled him with pride and determination. He was to take care of the temple's vegetable garden, a responsibility he embraced with the strong feeling of someone eager to prove his dedication to the path. This young monk had grown up in a household where exactness and control were highly valued. His father had been a careful accountant, and his mother had kept their family home with very strict standards. These influences shaped his way of thinking about spiritual practice, leading him to believe that enlightenment could be achieved through perfect order and the removal of all messiness. Each morning before dawn, he would arrive at the garden with his tools carefully lined up and his plan for the day meticulously organized. He spent countless hours studying which vegetables grew best in which locations, how far apart to space the young plants, and the best time for planting and harvesting. His notebook filled with detailed charts and precise measurements, but what took up most of his energy was his endless war against weeds. The moment he saw any unwanted plant growing between his neat rows of vegetables, he would jump on it with determination, pulling it from the earth and throwing it aside. He developed an almost magical ability to spot the slightest intrusion of dandelions, clover, or wild grasses into his orderly space. Weeks passed, and the garden began to reflect his vision of perfection. The vegetables grew in impossibly straight lines, each plant evenly spaced from its neighbors. The soil between the rows was bare and clean, carefully raked into smooth patterns. Not a single unwanted plant could be found anywhere within the garden's boundaries. One peaceful afternoon, as the sun filtered through the leaves of surrounding trees and cast dancing shadows across the temple grounds, the master came to visit the garden. He walked slowly along the neat pathways, observing the precise rows and the carefully maintained bare earth. His expression was thoughtful, almost dreamy, as he took in the scene. Finally, he stopped and stood quietly for several minutes, his head tilted as if he were listening for something. The young monk, who had been watching nervously from nearby, approached with obvious pride in his accomplishment. "Master," he said, pointing toward his perfect creation, "what do you think of the garden? I've worked very hard to make it perfect." The master continued his quiet contemplation for another moment before speaking. "The garden is very quiet," he said simply. The young monk's face brightened with satisfaction. He thought this was high praise from his teacher. "Yes," he replied eagerly. "I have removed all the noisy weeds, every single one. The garden is now peaceful and orderly, just as it should be." The master turned to look at his student with gentle eyes that held both kindness and sadness. A soft smile played at the corners of his mouth as he prepared to offer a teaching that would challenge everything the young monk believed about perfection and control. "And in doing so," the master said quietly, "you have also silenced the sound of the rain on their leaves, the rustle of the wind through their stems, and the hum of the insects that fed on their blossoms. Your garden is organized, but it is not whole." The young monk stood frozen, his mind struggling to understand what he had just heard. For the first time, he looked at his perfect garden, not with pride, but with new eyes. In that moment of changed perspective, he began to sense what was missing from his carefully controlled creation. As the Buddha once said, "The middle way is the safest." What comes from this story is a deep teaching about the dangers of extremes and the wisdom of accepting life's natural complexity. The young monk's search for perfect order represents a common spiritual trap: the belief that enlightenment means getting rid of all chaos, unpredictability, and apparent imperfections from our experience. Why do we struggle so deeply with accepting the messy complexity of life? Zen Buddhism points to our basic misunderstanding of what creates true peace and harmony. Our minds, trained to see things as problems and solutions, automatically label certain aspects of experience as unwanted and then try to get rid of them. This creates what Buddhist teachers call the war against reality. The monk's approach to the garden is like how many of us handle our inner lives. We see thoughts, emotions, or life situations as weeds that must be removed for us to be truly spiritual or peaceful. Worry becomes an enemy to defeat, sadness a problem to solve, anger a flaw to overcome. In our intense pursuit of inner calm, we often try to create a psychological landscape as bare and controlled as the monk's garden. But just as the garden's natural system needed the variety of plants to support insects, birds, and the full cycle of natural life, our inner system needs the full range of human experience to stay vibrant and whole. The emotions we label as negative often carry important information. Worry might signal that we need to pay attention to something important. Sadness might mean that we're feeling loss that we need to feel. Even anger might point us toward values we need to stand up for, or boundaries we need to establish. Zen teacher Suzuki Roshi spoke of beginner's mind, the openness and curiosity that allows us to see things newly, rather than through the filters of our preset ideas. The young monk had lost beginner's mind, replacing wonder with control, acceptance with manipulation. He could no longer hear the garden's natural music because he had decided beforehand what sounds were acceptable. Think about how this teaching applies to relationships in our lives. How often do we try to weed the people around us, attempting to eliminate their traits we find difficult or challenging? We might pull back our love when family members don't act as we think they should, become frustrated with friends who have different opinions, or try to change our partners to match our vision of the perfect relationship. The master's comment about missing sounds invites us to think about what we might be losing in our search for order and control. When we try to eliminate everything we've labeled as problematic, we often lose access to information, beauty, and aliveness that can only come through engaging with life's full complexity. Vietnamese Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh taught, "Thanks to impermanence, everything is possible." The weeds the monk eliminated were part of the garden's natural cycles of growth, death, and renewal. Their presence created a home for helpful insects. Their roots added good things to the soil when they broke down, and their variety supported the overall health of the natural system. In our spiritual practice, this wisdom invites us to work with, rather than against, the natural rhythms of our experience. Instead of trying to get rid of difficult emotions or challenging situations, we can learn to dance with them skillfully. This doesn't mean just accepting harmful situations, but rather a willingness to deal with life's complexities with wisdom and kindness, rather than just automatically pushing them away. The Buddha said, "Everything in moderation, including moderation." The young monk had missed this essential teaching about balance. His dedication to order was great, but taken too far. It created a bareness rather than harmony. True spiritual practice often involves finding the moving balance between effort and ease, structure and spontaneity, intention and acceptance. Japanese art loves the idea of wabi-sabi, finding beauty in imperfection and things that don't last. A garden that includes both cultivated vegetables and wild plants shows this idea, celebrating life's tendency toward variety and change, rather than trying to freeze it into perfect stillness. Tonight, as you think about your own relationship with control and acceptance, can you find areas where you might be creating overly bare gardens in your life? Perhaps you're trying to eliminate certain emotions, avoid particular types of people, or control results in ways that make your experience smaller rather than bigger. What sounds might you be missing in your search for quiet? The Buddha taught, "Chaos is natural in all things that are put together. Keep trying with diligence." The Master's teaching about the silent garden reminds us that true diligence involves learning to work in harmony with life's natural chaos, rather than wearing ourselves out trying to eliminate it. By accepting the full symphony of existence, including its not-so-nice notes, we discover a peace far richer than the fragile quiet of perfect control. Our next story reveals a deep truth about the nature of ultimate reality and our tendency to think too much about what can only be directly felt. On a dusty road leading to one of the great temples of ancient China, where people on religious trips and seekers travelled from distant lands to study with famous masters, an elderly woman had set up a small tea store. For 30 years, she had served simple refreshments to the monks, students, and spiritual seekers who passed her humble station. Her old, rough hands had poured countless cups of tea and prepared thousands of rice cakes, but she was not just a seller of food and drink. This old woman possessed a wisdom that few noticed, hidden beneath her ordinary appearance and simple job. She had developed a habit of asking the travelling monks a particular question, one that had become her own form of spiritual teaching. Whenever a monk would stop at her stall, bowing politely and asking for tea and rice cakes, she would serve them with careful attention and genuine kindness. But as they prepared to continue their journey, she would always ask the same question, delivered with the casual tone of someone making ordinary conversation. "The great master at the temple teaches of the ultimate reality," she would say, her eyes twinkling with barely hidden mischief. "Where is that reality right now?" This simple question had been asked of hundreds of monks over the decades. Some were young and eager, their heads full of newly learned philosophical ideas. Others were older and more learned, who knew a lot about the classical texts and had a sophisticated understanding of Buddhist ideas. All of them treated her question as an intellectual puzzle to be solved through clever thinking. The young monks would often launch into long explanations about the nature of emptiness, the way all things depend on each other, or the idea that everything is one. They would cite holy writings, quote famous masters, and show how well they understood complex philosophical principles. The older monks might offer more subtle responses, speaking of the fact that subject and object disappear, the mystery of true reality, or the limitations of thinking things through concepts. To every answer, no matter how complicated or well thought out, the old woman would respond with the same gentle phrase, "That's as may be." She would then silently serve their tea, her expression neither approving nor disapproving, neither encouraging nor dismissive. The monks would leave, often confused by her response, but generally thinking that her simple mind couldn't understand the depth of their answers. One morning, as mist rose from the valley and birds announced the dawn with their song, the temple's head cook was sent on an errand to a neighboring village. This man was not known for his learning or his eloquent speech. He had spent his years chopping vegetables, tending fires, and making sure the community was well fed. His hands were stained with work, his manner was straightforward, and his conversation tended toward practical matters rather than philosophical discussion. When he stopped at the old woman's stall, she greeted him with the same warmth she showed all travelers. He ordered a rice cake and stood quietly waiting, his mind already focused on the tasks that awaited him at his destination. As she prepared to hand him his food, she asked her familiar question. Where is the ultimate reality right now? The cook received the question without any apparent surprise or feeling that he was being tested. He didn't pause to consider various philosophical possibilities or search his memory for appropriate quotes. Instead, his response was immediate and utterly natural. He simply picked up one of her rice cakes from the display, held it out toward her with a gentle smile and said, "Here, have one of these." For a moment, the old woman stood completely still, her eyes wide with recognition and delight. Then her face broke into the broadest smile she had worn in 30 years. A laugh of pure joy escaped her lips as she realized that after 3 decades of questioning learned monks and accomplished scholars, she had finally encountered someone who truly understood. After 30 years, she said, her voice filled with wonder and satisfaction, I have finally found one who understands. Ancient Buddhist wisdom tells us the finger pointing at the moon is not the moon. Here we discover the essential difference between knowledge gained from concepts and direct understanding. The cook's simple gesture of offering a rice cake showed an understanding that went beyond all the long philosophical explanations offered by more learned monks. Why do we automatically make the simple truth of our immediate experience complicated? Zen Buddhism points to our deep training to believe that wisdom must be complex, that truth must be hidden, and that understanding requires complicated analysis. Our school systems train us to value abstract thinking over direct perception, to trust concepts over immediate awareness. The learned monks who visited the old woman's stall had fallen into what Buddhist teachers call the trap of knowledge. They had collected vast libraries of information about reality, but had lost touch with reality itself. Their minds had become so skilled at creating elaborate explanations that they could no longer recognize the obvious truth sitting right in front of them. Think about how often we make the same mistake in our daily lives. When someone asks us about happiness, we might launch into theories about positive psychology or philosophical discussions about the nature of fulfillment. But happiness itself is simply the warm feeling in your chest when you laugh with a friend, the satisfaction of completing a task well, or the peace of watching a sunset. It's not hidden in complex theories. It's available in direct experience. The cook's wisdom lay in his unself-conscious simplicity. He didn't try to impress the old woman with his knowledge because he wasn't performing for her approval. He simply responded from his natural understanding that ultimate reality is not separate from ordinary experience. The rice cake in his hand was not a symbol of ultimate reality. It was ultimate reality, completely present and immediately available. Zen teacher Alan Watts often spoke about the wisdom of insecurity, the understanding that our constant search for explanations and guarantees often stops us from recognizing what we're actually looking for. The monks seeking ultimate reality at the distant temple were like people searching everywhere for their glasses while wearing them. The old woman's 30-year teaching shows another deep truth. Genuine wisdom often comes from the most unexpected sources. The learned monks would never have expected to get spiritual instruction from a simple vendor of tea and rice cakes. Their prejudices about who possesses wisdom stopped them from recognizing a master sitting right in front of them. This pattern appears again and again in our lives. We often ignore the insights available from children, elderly people, service workers, or anyone who doesn't fit our picture of who should possess wisdom. We travel great distances to hear famous teachers while ignoring the deep lessons available from our immediate life situations and the ordinary people we meet daily. Dogen, the founder of Soto Zen, taught that practice and enlightenment are one. The cook showed this teaching perfectly. His years of chopping vegetables, preparing meals, and serving others had not been separate from his spiritual development. They had been his spiritual development. Every rice cake he prepared was an expression of Buddha nature. Every meal served was an offering of kindness. The Buddha said, "Look within, you are the Buddha." The cook's gesture pointed directly to this truth. Ultimate reality was not hidden in philosophical ideas or waiting to be discovered through complex practices. It was present in the simple act of offering food to another person, in the immediate reality of hands holding rice cakes, in the basic kindness of sharing what we have. Tonight, as you think about the various spiritual concepts and philosophical ideas you've heard, can you find the rice cake in your own experience? What simple, immediate reality are you overlooking while searching for something more profound? Perhaps it's the feeling of your breath moving in and out, the weight of your body against the chair, or the basic aliveness present in this very moment. The Buddha taught, "Better than 1,000 empty words is one word that brings peace." The cook spoke the most eloquent teaching of all, a wordless gesture of generosity that pointed directly to the heart of all teaching. In offering a simple rice cake, he showed that enlightenment is not about collecting knowledge, but about recognizing the sacred ordinariness that surrounds us always. Let us continue on our journey with a story that speaks to the fundamental question of responsibility and the freedom found in letting go. In a temple where autumn leaves painted the courtyard in shades of gold and red, there lived a monk whose face seemed permanently etched with worry lines. His brow remained furrowed whether he was walking through the gardens, sitting in quiet thought, or sharing meals with his brothers. A deep sigh came with his every movement, as if he carried an invisible weight that grew heavier with each passing day. This monk had originally come to the temple seeking peace and enlightenment, but instead found himself increasingly burdened by the awareness of suffering throughout the world. The more he learned about Buddhist teachings on kindness, the more strongly he felt every instance of pain and injustice he encountered. News of natural disasters left him sleepless. Stories of poverty and illness filled him with anguish. Even seeing an injured bird or a withered plant could send him into hours of troubled contemplation. His quiet thought sessions became exercises in worry rather than peace. Instead of finding the calm awareness described in the teachings, he found his mind churning with images of all the beings who were suffering at that very moment. He would sit on his cushion calculating how many people were experiencing hunger, how many animals were in pain, how many hearts were breaking from loss. The weight of this mental accounting pressed down on him until breathing itself felt difficult. The other monks began to notice his increasing agitation and withdrawal. Where he had once joined in enthusiastically in community activities, he now moved through his days with the heavy step of someone carrying an enormous burden. His shoulders seemed permanently hunched, as if he were literally supporting something massive and hard to handle. Finally, unable to bear the weight any longer, he sought out his teacher. He found the master in the garden calmly tending to a small flower bed, where late-blooming chrysanthemums added splashes of colour to the approaching winter landscape. The monk approached with his characteristic heavy walk and bowed deeply before speaking. "Master," he said, his voice thick with the emotion he had been carrying for months, "I am drowning in the suffering of the world. Every morning when I wake, I feel the weight of the entire world pressing down on my shoulders. The sorrow of all living beings has become a burden I cannot bear. How can I find peace when there is so much pain everywhere? How can I be happy when others are suffering? The master looked up from his flowers, taking in the younger monk's tortured expression and the tension visible in every line of his body. His eyes reflected both deep kindness for his student's pain and clarity about what needed to be understood. After a moment of quiet consideration, he offered a response that was surprising in its simplicity. "Then put it down," the master said gently. The monk's eyes widened in confusion. This seemed far too simple an answer for such a deep and overwhelming problem. He had expected a complex teaching about the nature of kindness, or perhaps a new quiet thought technique for dealing with difficult emotions, or at least some acknowledgement of how good his concern for all beings was. Seeing his student's confusion, the master set down his gardening tools and faced him directly. His voice remained gentle, but became more clear in its teaching. "Who asked you to pick it up?" He continued, "You are not carrying the world. You are carrying your idea of the world. Let go of your idea and see what remains." The Buddha understood that the root of suffering is fighting the truth that life includes suffering. This tale shows the crucial difference between genuine compassion and the self-imposed burden of trying to carry responsibilities that were never ours to bear. The monk's suffering arose not from the world's pain itself, but from his mental picture of that pain and his imagined duty to shoulder it personally. Why do we so easily pick up burdens that don't belong to us? Zen Buddhism points to several patterns in our trained thinking that create this unnecessary suffering. First is our tendency toward thinking we are bigger than we are, the ego's subtle inflation that convinces us we're responsible for fixing problems far beyond what we can actually influence. This creates a kind of spiritual arrogance disguised as compassion. Second is our confusion between feeling for others and getting tangled up in their feelings. True compassion keeps what Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron calls compassionate boundaries. We can feel genuine care for others' suffering without absorbing it into our own energy. The monk had lost this essential distinction, turning himself into a dumping ground for all the world's pain. Third is our addiction to worry as a way to falsely control things. By mentally going over all the suffering in the world, the monk created an illusion that his mental anguish was somehow helpful to those who were actually suffering. This represents a basic misunderstanding of how positive change occurs. Think about how often we do similar things. We worry about family members we cannot control, stress about political situations we cannot directly influence, or lose sleep over environmental problems that require collective action rather than individual anxiety. Each instance of unnecessary worry represents another example of picking up burdens that aren't ours to carry. The master's question, "Who asked you to pick it up?" points to the voluntary nature of most psychological suffering. We rarely recognize how much of our mental anguish comes from problems we've assigned ourselves, rather than difficulties actually requiring our attention. The world's suffering exists, but our personal responsibility is limited to our actual area of influence and ability to take effective action. Zen teacher Jack Cornfield writes, "Compassion is not a relationship between the healer and the wounded. It's a relationship between equals." The monk had positioned himself as somehow responsible for healing the world's wounds, rather than recognizing his shared participation in the human condition. This created a distorted relationship to suffering that increased, rather than decreased, the total amount of pain in the world. The deeper teaching here shows us that true compassion comes from wisdom, rather than emotion. When we're overwhelmed by the size of suffering, we become less capable of responding effectively to the specific instances of pain we actually encounter. The monk's constant worry about distant suffering may have stopped him from noticing and responding to immediate chances for kindness within his own community. Buddhist teacher Joseph Goldstein reminds us, the mind is everything. What you think, you become. The monk had become suffering itself, rather than someone capable of reducing suffering. His mental focus on global pain had turned him into another source of suffering for those around him. defeating the very kind intentions that motivated his worry. This teaching also shows the difference between caring and carrying. We can care deeply about situations without carrying them as personal burdens. A doctor can feel genuine concern for patients without taking their illnesses home emotionally. A parent can love their adult children without carrying responsibility for all their choices. A citizen can work for social justice without bearing personal guilt for every injustice. The master's instruction to let go of your idea points to one of Zen's most fundamental insights. We suffer primarily from our thoughts about reality rather than from reality itself. The world contains suffering, but it also contains joy, beauty, healing, and countless acts of kindness occurring simultaneously. The monk had selectively focused on only part of the picture, creating a mental construction that was far more unbearable than the actual world. Vietnamese Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh taught, "When you plant lettuce, if it does not grow well, you don't blame the lettuce. You look for reasons it is not doing well." The monk was blaming himself for the world's suffering rather than understanding the conditions that create unnecessary mental anguish. By examining his own mental habits, rather than trying to fix everything external, he could discover genuine peace. Tonight, as you notice the various worries and concerns occupying your mental space, can you tell the difference between what you're actually responsible for and what you've unnecessarily picked up? Perhaps you're carrying anxiety about situations you cannot control, guilt about problems you didn't create, or stress about results that depend on other people's choices. As the Buddha taught, you only lose what you cling to. The monk's clinging to his idea of global responsibility created the very burden he wished to escape. By practicing the art of putting down what was never his to carry, he could discover the lightness and effectiveness that come from focusing on what is actually within his power to influence with wisdom and love. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us turn to a teaching about the temporary nature of all our possessions and roles. This is the story of the inn that calls itself a palace. In ancient India, a renowned spiritual teacher had spent many years wandering from village to village, sharing the Buddha's teachings with anyone who would listen. His reputation for wisdom and kindness had spread throughout the land, reaching even the ears of kings and nobles. One day during his travels, he arrived at the capital city of a great kingdom, where a magnificent palace rose above the bustling streets like a jeweled crown. The palace was truly a wonder to behold. Its walls were constructed of the finest marble, inlaid with precious stones that caught and reflected the sunlight in brilliant cascades of color. Gardens filled with exotic flowers and flowing fountains surrounded the structure, and guards in gleaming armor stood at attention throughout the grounds. It was clearly the dwelling of someone who commanded immense wealth and power. The spiritual teacher approached the main entrance with the same calm dignity he brought to every encounter, whether with kings or beggars. The guards, recognizing him by his simple robes and peaceful presence, made no move to stop him. Word of his arrival had preceded him, and they had been instructed to allow him passage. Walking through corridors lined with silk tapestries and golden statues, the teacher made his way directly to the throne room, where the king sat upon an elaborately carved chair elevated above the marble floor. Courtiers in fine clothes gathered around the throne, their jeweled ornaments glinting in the light from tall windows. The king, a middle-aged man wearing robes of deep purple silk and a crown of gold and diamonds, looked up as the teacher entered. He had been expecting this visit, though he wasn't entirely sure what to expect from their encounter. "What do you want?" the king asked directly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate answers and unquestioning obedience. The teacher bowed respectfully, but spoke with quiet confidence. "Your Majesty, I would like a place to sleep in this inn." A ripple of surprise moved through the assembled courtiers. The king's eyebrows rose and his expression shifted from curiosity to confusion. "But this is not an inn," the king replied, gesturing to the rich surroundings. "This is my palace. I am the ruler of this kingdom, and this has been the seat of royal power for generations." The teacher nodded thoughtfully, as if considering this information carefully. "I see. "May I ask your majesty, who owned this palace before you?" "My father," the king replied, his tone becoming slightly defensive. "He ruled here for 30 years before his death. This palace was his seat of power, as it is now mine." "Ah," the teacher said with genuine interest. "And who owned it before him?" "My grandfather," the king answered, beginning to sense where these questions might lead. "He too ruled from this throne. He also is dead." The teacher paused, allowing the weight of these words to settle in the vast throne room. The courtiers had grown quiet, sensing the deep direction of this unusual conversation. Even the king found himself waiting, almost despite himself, for the teacher's response. Finally, the teacher spoke with gentle clarity that seemed to fill every corner of the ornate room. "And this place where people live for a short time and then move on, did I hear you say that it is not an inn?" The silence that followed was complete. The king sat motionless on his throne, the teacher's words penetrating layers of assumption and identity he had never questioned. The courtiers remained frozen, as if witnessing something beyond their normal understanding of royal rules and worldly power. The Buddha taught, "All things that are put together are temporary. Work out your salvation with diligence." This deep truth shows itself in the teacher's powerful question about the inn that calls itself a palace. Why do we hold so tightly to possessions and positions that are by their very nature temporary? Zen Buddhism explains that our attachment to permanence creates suffering because it conflicts with the fundamental reality of impermanence. Things don't last. Everything we think we own, including our own bodies and identities, we hold only for a short time. Look closely at your own experience. The house you call yours, the car you drive, the job title you carry, the bank account balance you monitor. All of these are temporary arrangements. You use them for a period of time, then move on, just as others used them before you and will use them after you. This doesn't mean we should become careless about our responsibilities or our possessions. Rather, it invites us to hold them more lightly, recognizing that they don't last forever. The king's palace was indeed magnificent and served important functions, but it was also clearly an inn where occupants stayed temporarily before leaving. The deeper teaching here shows us how identifying with temporary roles creates unnecessary suffering. When we forget that our positions don't last, whether as parent, professional, homeowner, or even student of Zen, we create anxiety, trying to hold on to what cannot be permanently maintained. Think about your own attachments. Perhaps it's your professional identity, your relationships, your health, or your spiritual achievements. Each of these is precious and worthy of care, but each is also subject to change. The executive becomes retired. The parent becomes an empty nester. The student becomes teacher. The healthy person faces illness. These transitions are not failures, but natural expressions of impermanence. Vietnamese Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh taught, "Thanks to impermanence, everything is possible." This teaching changes the way we see impermanence from something to fear into something to celebrate, because nothing lasts forever. Suffering states can turn into joy. Closed hearts can open to love, and even the most deeply set habits can shift toward wisdom. In Zen practice, we learn what's called non-attachment, caring deeply while holding lightly. This doesn't mean we become cold or indifferent, but that we learn to love without clinging, to work without grabbing, and to enjoy without demanding permanence. The spiritual teacher's insight cuts through the illusion that any of us are permanent owners of anything. We are all temporary guests in the inn of existence, borrowing our roles and possessions for the brief time we inhabit them. This recognition can bring either despair or profound freedom, depending on how we receive it. Buddha spoke of this when he said, "Everything is temporary. Try to achieve as much goodness as possible." This teaching encourages us not to waste our temporary time in the inn, but to use it wisely, cultivating love, wisdom, and kindness while we have the opportunity. Tonight, as you rest in your own temporary dwelling, surrounded by your own temporary possessions, can you feel the profound freedom that comes with recognizing that they don't last? Can you sense how this recognition might actually increase your appreciation rather than diminish it? As the Buddha taught, of all footprints, that of the elephant is best. Similarly, of all meditation topics, that on death is best. By remembering the temporary nature of our stay in this inn called life, we discover the urgency and preciousness of each moment we're given to practice love and awareness. Let us now turn to a tale that reveals how deeply our ego can hide even from ourselves. This is the story of the Prime Minister's lesson. In the grand capital of the Tang dynasty, where golden palaces rose toward heaven and scholars debated philosophy in moonlit gardens, there lived a man of amazing accomplishments. The Prime Minister had earned his position through brilliance in both leading the country and military strategy, defending the empire from invaders, while creating policies that brought prosperity to millions. His name was spoken with respect everywhere, and his advice was sought by the emperor himself. Yet despite his worldly success, the Prime Minister considered himself a humble student of the Buddha's teachings. Each week, he would leave behind the silk robes and important duties of his office, putting on simple clothes to visit his beloved Zen master in a modest temple on the outskirts of the city. There, surrounded by weathered wooden beams and the gentle sound of wind chimes, he would sit in quiet thought and receive instruction like any other sincere seeker. The relationship between the two men appeared beautifully balanced. The master treated his distinguished student with neither special respect nor dismissal, and the Prime Minister seemed to approach his teacher with genuine humility and respect. To observers, it appeared that political rank had no bearing on their spiritual connection. Simply a wise teacher guiding an honest student along the path of awakening. On one particular autumn afternoon, as golden leaves drifted past the temple windows, the Prime Minister settled into his usual position before his master. After their customary quiet thought, he posed a question that had been troubling him. "Your Reverence," he began with careful formality, "I have been thinking about what stops us spiritually. Could you please explain what egotism means according to Buddhist teaching?" The change in the master's way of acting was startling and immediate. His face flushed deep red, his eyes flashed with apparent anger, and in a voice dripping with looking down on him and contempt, he snapped back harshly. "What kind of stupid question is that? Have you learned nothing in all your visits here?" The Prime Minister recoiled as if physically hit. Never had his teacher spoken to him with such disrespect. His own face grew hot with indignation. How dare this simple monk who had never governed provinces or led armies speak to him in such a manner? Did he not understand to whom he was speaking? The Prime Minister's jaw tightened, his hands clenched, and his entire body bristled with wounded pride and rising fury. Then, just as suddenly as the storm had begun, the master's expression softened into a gentle smile. His voice returned to its usual warm, patient tone as he said quietly, "This, Your Excellency, is egotism." Buddha's wisdom reminds us the ego is a curtain between humans and God. What comes from this story is a profound teaching about the subtlety and persistence of our false sense of self. Even when we believe we have become humble, the ego remains, waiting for the right trigger to reveal its hidden presence. Why do we struggle to see our own egotism? Zen Buddhism teaches that the ego is like our own shadow, always present but rarely noticed because we're looking in the wrong direction. The ego is particularly clever at hiding itself in spiritual clothing. We can practice quiet thought for years, study holy texts, and even develop genuine compassion, all while keeping a subtle feeling of spiritual superiority or specialness. The Prime Minister's ego wasn't obvious in his daily spiritual practice. He appeared humble, respectful, and sincere. But when his dignity was challenged, when his sense of status and importance was threatened, the ego exploded with full force. This is the ego's signature. It reveals itself not in our calm moments, but in our reactive ones. Think about how often throughout your day you might experience similar moments. A colleague interrupts you during a meeting, and irritation flashes through your mind. A driver cuts you off in traffic and anger arises. Someone questions your expertise in an area you consider your specialty, and defensiveness emerges. These automatic reactions reveal the ego's constant watchfulness, always ready to defend its constructed image of who we think we are. Zen master Suzuki Roshi taught, "Each of you is perfect the way you are, and you can use a little improvement." This paradox points to the heart of working with ego. We must simultaneously accept ourselves completely while remaining willing to see through our self-deceptions. The ego thrives on both self-hatred and self-importance, but it disappears in the light of honest, compassionate self-observation. The master's skillful teaching method reveals another crucial insight. Sometimes the most effective spiritual instruction comes not through gentle guidance, but through direct confrontation with our unconscious patterns. The shock of having his dignity challenged in such an unexpected way created a moment of clarity for the Prime Minister. A sudden recognition of patterns that had been operating below the surface of his awareness. In Zen practice, we learn what might be called ego transparency, the ability to see through our self-protective mechanisms as they arise. This doesn't mean we get rid of the ego entirely, which would be neither possible nor desirable, but rather that we develop a lighter relationship with it. We learn to recognize its voice without automatically believing its stories. Tonight, as you notice moments of defensiveness, irritation, or wounded pride arising in your interactions, can you remember the Prime Minister's lesson? Can you see these reactions not as character flaws, but as opportunities for deeper self-understanding? As the Buddha taught, you only lose what you cling to. The ego is simply another thing we cling to, a collection of stories about who we think we are. In releasing our grip on these stories, we discover the freedom that lies beyond the prison of self-importance. Let us now turn to a tale about the thin boundary between heaven and hell within our own hearts. This is the story of the samurai and the gates. In feudal Japan, a battle-hardened warrior named Nobushige sought out the renowned Zen master Hakuin. The samurai's armor bore the scars of countless conflicts, and his eyes carried the weight of a man who had seen too much violence. He approached the master's simple dwelling with a question that had been burning in his mind since his last campaign. "Master Hakuin," Nobushige said, bowing stiffly in his heavy armor, "I have spent my life fighting for my lord, facing death countless times. Tell me truthfully, is there really a paradise and a hell awaiting us after death?" Hakuin looked up from his tea, studying the warrior with penetrating eyes. "Who are you to ask such a question?" he inquired calmly. "I am a samurai," Nobushige replied with pride, straightening his shoulders. "I serve my lord with honor and have never retreated from battle." Hakuin's expression suddenly shifted to one of disdain. "You, a soldier!" he exclaimed with a dismissive laugh. "What kind of ruler would have you as his guard? Look at yourself. Your face looks like that of a common beggar, weathered and crude. How could someone so lowly claim to be a protector of nobility?" The words struck Nobushige like physical blows. His face flushed red with anger, and his hand instinctively moved to the hilt of his sword. The insult to his honor was unbearable. "So you have a sword?" Hakuin continued, his voice dripping with mockery. "Your weapon is probably much too dull to cut off my head. I doubt you could slice through a rice paper screen, let alone defend anyone of importance." Unable to contain his rage any longer, Nobushige began to draw his sword, the steel singing as it emerged from its sheath. His entire body trembled with fury. His vision narrowed to focus solely on this disrespectful monk who dared to question his honor. At that precise moment, as the blade caught the afternoon light, Hakuin spoke with sudden clarity. "Here, open the gates of hell." The words pierced through Nobushige's rage like an arrow finding its target. In that instant, he saw himself clearly, consumed by anger, ready to kill over wounded pride. His mind clouded by fury. He understood that hell was not some distant realm, but the very state he inhabited in that moment. The samurai's hand froze on his sword as recognition dawned across his features. Slowly, with great respect, Nobushige sheathed his sword and bowed deeply before the master. His anger transformed into profound gratitude. "Here, open the gates of paradise," Hakuin said gently, his voice now filled with compassion. Buddha's wisdom reminds us hatred does not stop by hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal rule. What comes from this story is a surprising revelation about the map of our inner world. Heaven and hell are not distant places, but present moment experiences we create through the quality of our consciousness. Why do we so easily find ourselves at the gates of hell? Zen Buddhism points to the three poisons that cloud our minds: greed, hatred, and delusion. When Nobushige's pride was wounded, hatred arose instantly, turning a peaceful afternoon into a realm of suffering. His entire reality shifted from curiosity about the afterlife to murderous rage in mere moments. The deeper teaching here shows us that we carry within ourselves the capacity for both states. Paradise and hell are not places we go to after death. They are experiences we inhabit while living. Each moment offers us the choice between the hell of reacting and the paradise of awareness. Think about how often throughout your day similar changes occur. A critical email arrives and suddenly your peaceful morning becomes a realm of anxiety and resentment. Someone cuts you off in traffic and the spaciousness of your drive contracts into a tight knot of irritation. A thoughtless comment from a colleague and your contentment dissolves into hurt feelings and defensive thoughts. In Zen practice, we learn the capacity to recognize these moments of transition. Like Nobushige drawing his sword, we learn to catch ourselves at the very moment we're about to enter hell through our reactions. This recognition itself becomes the key that opens the gates of paradise. Zen master Huangbo taught, "The foolish ignore what they see, not what they think. The wise ignore what they think, not what they see." When we're caught in reacting, we're ignoring the present moment, the master's teaching, the opportunity for awakening, in favor of our thoughts about how things should be. The Buddha said, "Better than 1,000 empty words is one word that brings peace." Hakuin's apparent insults were not cruelty, but kindness in disguise. By provoking Nobushige's anger so skillfully, he showed the warrior exactly what he needed to see. That hell is a state of mind we enter through our own choices. This teaching invites us to examine our own triggers. What words or situations instantly transport us to hell? Perhaps it's feeling unappreciated at work, being misunderstood by family, or facing unexpected challenges. Each of these experiences offers the same choice Nobushige faced. Will we draw our sword or recognize the teaching? Tonight, as you notice irritation arising in response to some frustration, can you remember Hakuin's lesson? Can you recognize the moment when you're about to enter hell through your reactions and instead choose the paradise of awareness? As the Buddha taught, what we think we become. In each moment, we are either opening the gates of hell through unconscious reacting or opening the gates of paradise through mindful presence. Let us continue with a story about the limits of understanding and the honesty of not knowing. This is the teaching of the Emperor and Master Gudo. The Emperor of Japan, a man accustomed to receiving definite answers from his advisors and scholars, had arranged a private meeting with Master Gudo, one of the most respected Zen teachers in the realm. The Emperor came with genuine curiosity about spiritual matters, particularly questions about life, death, and what might lie beyond ordinary understanding. Seated in the formal chamber, where matters of state were usually discussed, the Emperor felt comfortable posing even the most profound questions to this renowned master. After all, if anyone would possess answers to life's deepest mysteries, surely it would be an enlightened Zen teacher who had spent decades in contemplation and practice. Master Gudo, the Emperor began, with the directness that comes from a lifetime of authority. I have a question that has troubled many great minds throughout history. What happens to a man of enlightenment after death? Surely, someone of your spiritual attainment would understand such matters. The emperor expected a profound speech on the nature of consciousness after physical death, perhaps insights into rebirth, karma, or the eternal nature of awakened awareness. He was prepared to hear about subtle realms, the dissolution of individual consciousness into cosmic unity, or other elevated teachings that would satisfy his curiosity about this ultimate mystery. Instead, Master Gudo looked at the emperor with complete calmness and gave the most honest answer possible. How should I know? The emperor was taken aback. Here was a master revered throughout the land for his wisdom, essentially admitting ignorance about what seemed like a fundamental spiritual question. But master, the emperor pressed, somewhat disbelieving. You are an enlightened teacher. Surely you must have special knowledge about such things. Gudo's response was immediate and perfectly logical. Yes, sir, but not a dead one. The simplicity of this exchange contains a profound teaching about the nature of genuine wisdom and the difference between authentic understanding and pretended knowledge. As the Buddha taught, I know nothing except the fact of my ignorance. This ancient wisdom shows the profound honesty that characterizes true spiritual maturity, the willingness to admit the limits of one's knowledge rather than pretending to understand what cannot be known from one's current position. Why do we expect spiritual teachers to have answers to questions that can only be resolved through direct experience? Zen Buddhism emphasizes the importance of telling the difference between knowledge gained from concepts and lived understanding, between what we can theorize about and what we can actually know. Master Gudo's response wasn't a failure of wisdom, but a demonstration of it. He refused to engage in guessing about experiences he hadn't had, even when pushed by someone in a position of great authority. His honesty revealed more wisdom than any elaborate theory about what happens after death could have provided. Think about how often in daily life we pretend to know things we don't actually know, whether it's offering confident opinions about complex social issues, giving definite advice about other people's relationships, or claiming certainty about uncertain outcomes. We often feel pressured to appear knowledgeable rather than admitting the limits of our understanding. The emperor's assumption that enlightenment should include knowledge about death reflects a common misconception about spiritual development. We imagine that awakening provides a complete database of cosmic information rather than a fundamental shift in how we relate to not knowing. In Zen practice, we learn what Suzuki Roshi called don't know mind, a state of open awareness that doesn't need to fill every gap in understanding with theories or beliefs. This isn't ignorance, but a wise recognition that direct experience is more valuable than second-hand information. Zen Master Linchi taught, there is nothing special to do, nothing special to learn. Enlightenment doesn't grant supernatural knowledge about matters beyond ordinary experience. A living master knows about living. What happens after death remains in the realm of speculation until one actually dies. The Buddha said, believe nothing merely because you have been told it, but whatsoever after due examination and analysis you find to be good, beneficial, for the welfare of all beings. That teaching believe and cling to. Even the Buddha encouraged direct investigation over accepting claims based on authority. Gudo's teaching reveals the freedom that comes from releasing the need to have opinions about everything. How much mental energy do we waste constructing theories about things we cannot possibly know? How much suffering comes from worrying about situations we can only imagine? Look deeply at your own relationship with not knowing. Where do you pretend certainty to avoid the discomfort of uncertainty? What would change if you could say, I don't know, with the same confidence that Master Gudo displayed? The emperor sought knowledge about death from someone who was vibrantly alive. But true wisdom might be found not in collecting information about future experiences, but in fully engaging with present reality. The mystery of death is honored not by pretending to solve it, but by living authentically in the face of it. Tonight, as you encounter questions about the future, about others' motivations, Or about cosmic mysteries, can you remember Master Gudo's honest simplicity? Can you find the courage to admit when you don't know? Discovering that don't know mind might be wiser than all our clever theories. Buddha's wisdom reminds us the only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing. In a world full of false certainties and confident ignorance, the Master's honest, "How should I know?" points toward a more genuine relationship with mystery, one that honors what cannot be known while fully embracing what can be directly experienced. As we continue our journey, let us now turn to a story about acceptance and the art of contentment. This is the shepherd's wisdom. Along a dusty mountain road where wildflowers dotted the hillsides, a weary traveller encountered a shepherd tending his flock. The morning sun climbed steadily higher, and clouds gathered on the horizon, creating an uncertain sky that could promise either gentle rain or scorching heat. The shepherd sat peacefully on a smooth boulder, watching his sheep graze contentedly among wild grasses. His face bore the calm expression of one who had spent countless seasons under open sky, learning lessons that only nature can teach. There was something in his demeanor, a quality of unshakable serenity that drew the traveller's attention. "Good morning, friend," the traveller called out, wiping sweat from his brow. "What kind of weather are we going to have today?" The shepherd looked up with eyes that held mountain stream clarity and smiled with genuine warmth. "The kind of weather I like," he replied simply, as if this were the most obvious answer in the world. The traveller paused, confused. He had expected a practical forecast that would help him plan his day. Instead, he received what seemed like circular logic, offering no useful information. "How do you know it will be the kind of weather you like?" The traveller pressed, his voice carrying frustration mixed with curiosity. The shepherd's smile deepened, and he pointed toward the vast sky above them, where clouds and clear patches moved in their eternal dance. "Having found out, sir, that I cannot always get what I like," he said, with the patience of one who had learned life's most essential lesson. "I have learned to always like what I get, so I am quite sure we will have the kind of weather I like." The traveller stood in silence, the profound simplicity of this wisdom settling into his understanding like seeds, finding fertile ground. Here was a man who had discovered something that all the weather predictions in the world could not provide: complete freedom from the anxiety of uncertainty. As the Buddha observed, attachment is the root of suffering. What comes from this story is the recognition that true contentment comes not from controlling external circumstances, but from changing our relationship to whatever circumstances arise. Why do we wear ourselves out trying to arrange life according to our preferences, rather than learning to find peace within whatever life presents? The shepherd represents what Zen calls great acceptance, not passively giving up, but the profound wisdom that recognizes resistance to reality as the primary source of suffering. When we fight against what is, we create an internal war that drains our energy and blocks our capacity for contentment. When we learn to align ourselves with reality as it unfolds, we discover the tremendous peace that comes from swimming with the current rather than against it. Think about how much mental and emotional energy we spend each day fighting circumstances beyond our control. Traffic jams, weather that doesn't match our plans, people who don't behave as we think they should. Each resistance creates a small contraction in our awareness, a tiny rebellion against reality that accumulates into chronic dissatisfaction. The shepherd's approach doesn't mean becoming passive or ceasing to have preferences. We can still hope for sunny days while fully accepting rainy ones. We can work toward goals while finding peace when outcomes differ from expectations. The key lies in holding our preferences lightly, rather than allowing them to determine our contentment. Zen Master Seung Sahn wrote, "The great way is not difficult for those who have no preferences." This doesn't suggest getting rid of all desires, but rather not allowing those desires to become demands that reality must fulfill for us to be okay. Look deeply at your own patterns of resistance. How often do you find yourself arguing with reality, wishing circumstances were different, or believing you'll be content when things change. This tension is optional, not because you should suppress your desires, but because you can learn to hold them more skillfully. The Buddha taught that attachment doesn't mean caring deeply about things. It means making our inner peace conditional on external circumstances arranging themselves according to our specifications. The shepherd cares about his flock and appreciates comfort, but his fundamental contentment doesn't depend on any particular outcome. Tonight, as you reflect on the day's experiences, both pleasant and challenging, can you find the shepherd's secret within your own awareness? What if contentment isn't waiting for better circumstances, but is available right now through a shift in perspective? As the Buddha taught, happiness does not depend on what you have or who you are. It solely relies on what you think. The shepherd discovered that when we stop demanding that life conform to our expectations, we find the freedom to enjoy life exactly as it presents itself. Our next story reveals a profound teaching about the nature of emptiness and the surprising places where we discover truth. This is the story of grasping what cannot be held. In a quiet temple garden, where cherry blossoms drifted gently on the morning breeze, Master Sayadaw sat with one of his most earnest students. The young monk had been studying Buddhist philosophy for several years, filling his mind with concepts about the nature of reality, the illusion of the self, and the teaching of emptiness that seemed so central to the Buddha's wisdom. He could recite passages about shunyata, discuss the philosophical implications of non-being, and engage in lengthy debates about the relationship between form and void. But for all his intellectual understanding, something felt missing. The words remained just words, concepts floating in his mind without the direct experience that would make them real. He approached his teacher that morning with a question that had been troubling him for months. "Master," the young monk said, bowing respectfully, "I have studied the teaching of emptiness extensively. I understand that all things arise and pass away, that nothing has permanent, independent existence, but I feel like I'm only grasping concepts. Can you help me get hold of emptiness itself?" Sayadaw looked at his student with knowing eyes. He had seen this struggle many times before. The gap between intellectual understanding and direct realization, the frustration of trying to grasp with the mind what can only be known through experience. "Show me how you would get hold of emptiness," the master said simply. The monk thought for a moment, then cupped his hands in the air as if he were trying to capture something invisible. He held his hands carefully, as though cradling a soap bubble that might burst at any moment. His face was earnest and concentrated, his entire being focused on this attempt to demonstrate his understanding of a teaching about the very nature of nothingness. "There," he said, holding his cupped hands very still. "I'm trying to hold emptiness itself." Sayadaw looked at the student's empty hands and shook his head gently. "That's not very good," he said with a slight smile. "You haven't got anything in there at all. You're just holding air and calling it something special." The monk's face fell. He had been so certain that his gesture captured something meaningful about the teaching. "Well, master," he said, his voice tinged with disappointment and confusion, "please show me a better way. How does one truly get hold of emptiness?" Without warning, Master Sayadaw reached out and grabbed the monk's nose, giving it a sharp, firm yank. "Ouch!" the monk yelled, his hands flying to his face, his eyes watering from the sudden, unexpected pain. "Master, that hurt me." Sayadaw released his grip and smiled broadly. "Now that," he said with satisfaction, "is how you get hold of emptiness." The monk stood there rubbing his nose, completely bewildered. His nose throbbed with very real, very unempty pain. What did this undeniable presence of discomfort have anything to do with emptiness? It seemed like the opposite of everything he had been studying. But as the initial shock wore off, something began to shift in his understanding. The pain in his nose was absolutely real, yet it was also completely temporary, already beginning to fade. It had arisen from nowhere, would disappear completely, and left no permanent mark on reality. It was both utterly present and completely insubstantial. More importantly, in the moment of that sharp sensation, all his conceptual thinking about emptiness had vanished entirely. There had been no philosophical analysis, no abstract understanding, just direct, immediate experience. The gap between the one experiencing and the thing experienced had dissolved in the simple reality of ouch. As the Buddha taught, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Here we discover that emptiness is not the absence of experience, but the very nature of all experience. Everything arises, exists for a moment and passes away, leaving no permanent trace, while being completely real in its moment of appearing. Why do we struggle so hard to understand emptiness conceptually when it's the very fabric of every moment? Zen Buddhism points to our habit of trying to grasp reality with our thinking minds rather than experiencing it directly. We turn the most immediate truths into abstract philosophies, then wonder why they feel distant and theoretical. The monk's mistake was common and understandable. He was trying to hold emptiness as if it were a thing, an object that could be captured and possessed. But emptiness isn't an object. It's the very condition that allows all objects to appear and disappear. It's not something we can grasp. It's what makes grasping possible. Think about your own experience right now. The thoughts arising in your mind. Where do they come from? Where do they go when they fade? The sensations in your body, the sounds around you, even your sense of being someone who is reading these words, all of it is appearing and disappearing in the space of awareness, like clouds in an empty sky. This emptiness isn't blank nothingness. It's alive, responsive, creative, the very capacity for experience itself. When Sado yanked his student's nose, he wasn't demonstrating the absence of sensation. But the miraculous way sensation appears from nowhere, exists vividly, and dissolves back into nowhere, all within the spacious emptiness of awareness. Zen master Huangbo taught, "The foolish ignore what they see, not what they think. The wise ignore what they think, not what they see." The monk was ignoring his direct experience in favor of his concepts about experience. The master's intervention brought him back to the immediacy of seeing, feeling, and knowing without the filter of philosophical analysis. In our daily lives, we constantly encounter this same teaching. The anger that seems so solid and permanent when we're caught in it, where does it go when it naturally subsides? The worry that feels so important and real, what is its actual substance when we look closely? Even our sense of being a solid, separate self, isn't it actually more like a flowing process, a river that appears to be the same while constantly changing? The Buddha said, "All things that are put together are temporary. Work out your salvation with diligence." This isn't a philosophical statement, but a direct pointing to what's happening right now. Everything we experience is empty in the sense that it has no permanent independent existence. Yet, it's all perfectly real as it appears. Tonight, as you notice thoughts, sensations, and experiences arising and passing in your awareness, can you sense the emptiness that Sado was pointing to? Not as an abstract concept, but as the very space in which your life is unfolding. Can you feel how this emptiness is not separate from the fullness of your experience, but is its very nature? Buddha's wisdom reminds us in the sky there is no distinction of east and west. People create distinctions out of their own minds and then believe them to be true. The emptiness of all things isn't something we need to achieve or understand. It's what we are, what everything is right now. We just need to stop trying to grasp it and let ourselves be grasped by it instead. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, we encounter a story about perception's power to create reality. This is the tale of the eggplant in the dark. In a mountain temple where silence was treasured, there lived a monk renowned for strict adherence to Buddhist precepts. His devotion was unwavering, his quiet thought exemplary, his commitment to non-violence absolute. For years he had walked the path with careful attention to every rule, finding comfort in structure and certainty. One moonless night, Returning from evening meditation, he walked slowly along the garden path to his quarters. The darkness was complete, broken only by faint outlines of familiar landmarks. He knew this path intimately. Yet tonight, something felt different. Suddenly, his foot came down on something soft and yielding. The object made a distinct squishing sound that pierced the quiet like a bell. The monk froze, his heart racing as his mind conjured the most likely explanation. He had stepped on an egg-bearing frog. The realization struck like a physical blow. The first rule forbids taking life. And here he was, a dedicated practitioner, having just killed a pregnant creature. Not only had he taken one life, but potentially dozens. Horror washed over him in waves. His hands trembled as he knelt in darkness, trying to determine what happened, but the night was too black to see. His mind spun with questions and accusations. How could he have been so careless? Was this a spiritual test he had failed catastrophically? Sleep became impossible. When he finally lay down, his mind churned with guilt and self-doubt. In his dreams, hundreds of frogs appeared, their eyes accusatory, demanding justice for their fallen mother and unborn siblings. They surrounded him, voices rising in condemnation that echoed through his consciousness. The monk woke repeatedly, each time remembering anew what he believed he had done. His carefully cultivated peace was shattered, replaced by torment that grew stronger with each passing hour. He questioned not only this moment, but his entire spiritual practice. As dawn broke, painting the temple gardens in soft golden light, the monk returned to face the reality of his actions. His steps were heavy with dread as he approached the familiar path. But when morning light revealed the truth, the monk stopped in complete astonishment. There lay not the remains of a frog, but an overripe eggplant that had fallen from the monastery garden. The purple vegetable had split open when he stepped on it, creating the squishing sound that triggered his night of anguish. In that moment of recognition, something extraordinary happened. The monk felt a sudden shift in understanding that went far beyond relief. For the first time in years of study, he truly grasped the teaching that there is no objective world. His entire night of suffering had been created not by external reality, but by his mind's interpretation of an ambiguous experience. Standing in the garden, looking at the harmless eggplant, the monk finally understood how to practice Zen. It wasn't about perfect adherence to rules or avoiding all error. It was about seeing clearly without the distortions of assumption and mental elaboration. The Buddha once said, "We are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world." This teaching captures what the monk discovered. Our experience of reality is largely created by mental interpretations rather than objective circumstances. The deeper teaching here shows us how powerfully perceptions shape emotional reality. The monk's actual experience was minimal, stepping on something soft in darkness. Everything that followed was generated entirely by his mind's interpretation of that simple sensory event. Why do we construct elaborate stories from incomplete information? Our minds evolved to make rapid assessments for survival, often filling gaps with worst-case scenarios. This mental habit served our ancestors well when danger was immediate and physical, but creates unnecessary suffering when applied to modern psychological situations. Think about how often you step on metaphorical eggplants in the dark. Your friend doesn't return your text immediately, and you assume you've offended them. A colleague seems distant in a meeting, and you convince yourself they're angry about your presentation. Your partner comes home quieter than usual, and you imagine relationship problems that may exist only in your worried mind. Each scenario follows the same pattern: ambiguous sensory input, followed by mental interpretation, followed by emotional reaction to the interpretation, rather than the actual event. We suffer not from what happens, but from what we think about what happens. Zen master Suzuki Roshi taught, "In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind, there are few." The monk had become an expert in following rules, but a beginner in seeing clearly. His expertise actually became a limitation when it caused him to jump to conclusions based on preset ideas. This story invites us to examine our tendency toward premature interpretation. How often do we create our own nightmares by assuming the worst about ambiguous situations? How much daily stress comes from responding to imagined scenarios rather than actual circumstances? Tonight, as you encounter the inevitable ambiguities of human interaction, can you remember the monk and the eggplant? When your mind begins constructing stories about unclear situations, can you step back and ask, what do I actually know for certain? And what am I adding through interpretation? Buddha's wisdom reminds us, doubt everything. Find your own light. The monk's awakening came not from following external rules more perfectly, but from discovering the clarity that was always available within him. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us turn to a story about the difference between resistance and flow. This is the teaching of the old man and the waterfall. In a mountain village where a swift river carved its way through ancient rocks, an old Taoist sage often walked along the water's edge, observing the interplay between the flowing current and the solid stones that tried to redirect its path. The villagers knew him as a gentle, contemplative man who seemed to understand something profound about the natural world that others missed. One afternoon, as storm clouds gathered and rain began to fall, the river swelled with unusual force. The current grew violent and unpredictable, rushing toward a high waterfall that dropped into a rocky gorge below. Most people avoided the area during such conditions, knowing that anyone who fell into the rapids would face almost certain death against the jagged rocks at the bottom of the falls. The old man, however, had been caught by the sudden storm while walking along his usual path. As he tried to make his way back to safety, the muddy bank gave way beneath his feet. Before he could catch himself, he tumbled into the raging torrent and was immediately swept away by the powerful current. Villagers who witnessed his fall cried out in horror. They ran along the riverbank, helplessly watching as the old man was carried toward the waterfall by waters too violent and swift for any rescue attempt. They could only watch in anguish as he disappeared over the edge, plunging into the churning chaos below. Everyone assumed the worst. No one could survive such a fall, especially not an elderly man with limited strength. The villagers prepared themselves to search for his body downstream once the waters calmed enough to make such a search possible. But to their amazement, as they hurried toward the base of the waterfall, they saw the old man emerging from the water far below, completely unharmed. He walked calmly to the shore, water streaming from his clothes, and sat down to rest as peacefully as if he had simply taken a refreshing swim on a pleasant day. The villagers rushed to him, unable to believe what they had witnessed. "How is this possible?" they asked in wonder. "How did you survive that terrible fall? The water was so violent, the rocks so dangerous. By all reason, you should have been killed." The old man smiled at their concern and amazement. He wrung water from his sleeves and considered their question carefully before answering. "I survived," he said simply, "because I accommodated myself to the water, not the water to me. When I felt myself falling, I did not fight against the current or try to force it to change direction. Without thinking, I allowed myself to be shaped by it. When the water wanted to go down, I went down. When it swirled, I swirled with it. Plunging into the whirlpool, I came out with the whirlpool. I became like the water itself, and this is how I survived." The villagers listened in silence, beginning to understand that they had witnessed something far more than a fortunate accident. They had seen a demonstration of a profound principle that the old man had spent years learning from his careful observation of the natural world. As the Buddha taught, nothing is permanent. Everything is subject to change. Being is always becoming. Here we discover the wisdom of working with life's currents rather than exhausting ourselves in useless resistance to forces beyond our control. Why do we automatically fight against difficult circumstances when flow and adaptation might serve us better? Zen Buddhism reveals that our ego mind believes it can control external conditions through force of will, but this approach often creates more suffering than the original difficulty. The old man's survival wasn't mere luck. It was the result of understanding something essential about the nature of existence itself. When we align ourselves with the natural flow of events rather than demanding that life conform to our preferences, we often discover resources and possibilities that resistance makes invisible. Think about your own relationship with challenging circumstances. How much energy do you spend fighting against situations you cannot change? The old man's teaching suggests a different approach, not passively giving up, but conscious adaptation that maintains our essential nature while flowing with changing conditions. This doesn't mean accepting harmful situations or abandoning our values. The old man didn't give up his desire to survive. He simply changed his strategy for survival. Instead of fighting the water's power, he used it. Instead of resisting its direction, he moved with it while maintaining his awareness and intention. In relationships, careers, and personal challenges, we often face similar choices. We can wear ourselves out trying to force results, control other people's behavior, or make external circumstances conform to our expectations. Or we can learn to work skillfully with what is actually present, finding creative ways to achieve our deeper purposes through accommodation rather than force. Zen master Lao Tzu taught, "Water is fluid, soft, and yielding, but water will wear away rock which cannot yield and is destroyed." The old man embodied this teaching, demonstrating that apparent weakness can be a source of tremendous strength when applied with wisdom. The Buddha said, "Hatred does not stop by hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal rule." This principle extends beyond hatred to all forms of resistance. Problems are rarely solved by fighting against them directly, but by understanding their nature and finding ways to work with the underlying forces involved. Look deeply at a current source of stress or conflict in your life. Where are you trying to force the water to change direction, rather than learning to swim with it? What would it mean to accommodate yourself to the situation while maintaining your essential values and intentions? Tonight, as you encounter the inevitable currents of daily life, unexpected changes, difficult people, circumstances beyond your control, can you remember the old man's wisdom? Can you find ways to maintain your center while flowing with forces you cannot change? Discovering that sometimes the most direct path to your goals is the one that appears to go around obstacles rather than through them. Buddha's wisdom reminds us in the end, just three things matter: how well we have lived, how well we have loved, how well we have learned to let go. Learning to flow with life's currents is ultimately about letting go of our need to control everything while maintaining our ability to respond wisely to whatever arises. Like water, we can be both powerful and yielding, both persistent and adaptive, both strong and gentle. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us explore a story about transforming our relationship with suffering. This is the tale of the salt and the lake. In a quiet temple nestled among rolling hills, there lived an aging master renowned for his patience and wisdom. Among his students was a young apprentice whose heart had become heavy with complaints about life's difficulties. Each morning, the apprentice would arrive with fresh grievances. "Master, why is life so hard? Yesterday my meditation was disturbed by noise. Today my back aches from the hard floor. When will this suffering end?" His voice carried the weight of someone who had catalogued every small discomfort until they had grown into an overwhelming burden. The master listened with endless patience, but as days turned to weeks, he recognized that words alone would not shift his student's perspective. One crisp morning, as golden sunlight streamed through their simple dwelling, the master made an unusual request. "My dear student," he said gently, "I need you to go to the kitchen and bring me some salt. Just a handful will suffice." The apprentice, puzzled by the simple task, nonetheless obeyed. He returned with cupped palms containing coarse white crystals. "Now," the master instructed, producing a small glass of water. Place all of that salt into this glass and drink it. The young man hesitated. Master, that seems like far too much salt for such a small amount of water. Trust the process, the master replied. Drink. The apprentice poured the salt into the glass, watching the crystals dissolve into a cloudy, unappetizing mixture. He lifted it to his lips and took a large gulp, immediately grimacing as the intensely bitter taste filled his mouth. How does it taste? The master asked. Bitter, the apprentice spat. Terribly, overwhelmingly bitter. I can barely stand it. The master chuckled softly. Excellent. Now bring that same amount of salt and come with me. Together, they walked in contemplative silence until they reached the shores of a pristine mountain lake. The water stretched before them like a mirror, reflecting the sky so perfectly that it was difficult to tell where earth ended and heaven began. Now, the master said, place this handful of salt into the lake. The apprentice waded into the shallow water and opened his hands, watching as the salt crystals scattered across the lake's surface, quickly dissolving without leaving any visible trace. Drink from the lake, the master instructed. The young man cupped the lake water in his hands and brought it to his lips. The water was clean, refreshing, with the pure taste of mountain streams. How does it taste? The master asked. Fresh, the apprentice replied, genuinely surprised. Clean and pure. Do you taste the salt? The master inquired gently. The student paused, paying careful attention. No, he said slowly. I don't taste any salt at all. The master sat beside his student on a smooth stone at the water's edge. His weathered hands reached out to clasp the young man's hands in profound tenderness. My dear student, the master said, the pain of life is pure salt, no more, no less. The amount of pain in existence remains constant, but the amount of bitterness we experience depends entirely on the container we put that pain into. The apprentice listened with new understanding. When you are in pain, the master continued, the only thing you can truly control is your response. You can choose to be a small glass where every grain of salt overwhelms your senses, or you can choose to enlarge your sense of things, to become like this vast lake where the same salt dissolves harmlessly into something much greater. The master paused. Stop being a glass, my friend. Become a lake. The Buddha once said, pain is certain, suffering is optional. This fundamental teaching reveals the heart of our relationship with difficulty. We cannot eliminate the challenges woven into human existence, but we have tremendous power over how that pain affects us. What comes from this story is understanding about consciousness itself. Our awareness is not fixed in size. It can contract into the narrow confines of a glass where every difficulty looms enormous, or it can expand into the spaciousness of a lake where the same difficulties become manageable. Why do we often choose to be the glass rather than the lake? First is our tendency toward pain myopia, becoming so focused on discomfort that it fills our entire awareness. Second is our habit of story proliferation, taking a single painful event and creating long stories about how unfair life is. Third is the comparing mind, measuring our pain against an imaginary standard of how life should be. The lake perspective doesn't minimize genuine pain or suggest passively accepting everything. Rather, it offers a skillful way of relating to inevitable challenges that doesn't compound them with unnecessary suffering. From lake consciousness, we can respond to problems more creatively because we're not overwhelmed. Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh taught, thanks to impermanence, everything is possible. From the lake perspective, we remember that everything arises and passes away within the vast space of awareness. Today's crisis becomes tomorrow's memory. We become a lake through practices that naturally expand awareness. Quiet thought teaches us to rest in spacious presence. Thankfulness helps us notice experiences beyond immediate difficulties. Service reminds us that our pain is part of shared human experience. Tonight, as you reflect on current challenges, Can you sense the difference between experiencing them from glass consciousness versus lake consciousness? What would it feel like to allow your awareness to expand beyond the immediate intensity of difficulties to include the vast context of this moment? As the Buddha taught, if you want to know your mind, sit down and observe it. If your mind is clear, happiness will come. The clarity he speaks of is not the absence of salt, but the spaciousness to hold it skillfully. In becoming lakes rather than glasses, we discover that pain can become a gateway to deeper kindness and freedom. Now let us explore a story about the paradoxical nature of spiritual seeing and the limits of conceptual understanding. This is the teaching of 3 strikes and deeper vision. In the mountain temple where the 6th patriarch Huineng taught, students came from across China to study with the master whose realization was said to surpass all others of his time. Among these seekers was a brilliant young monk named Shen Hui, known for his sharp intellect and probing questions. Unlike many students who approached the patriarch with humble requests for basic instruction, Shen Hui often challenged the master with sophisticated philosophical inquiries. One afternoon, as golden sunlight streamed through the temple windows and the air carried the peaceful sounds of monks going about their daily practice, Shen Hui found the 6th patriarch sitting quietly in the main hall. The master's posture was perfectly still, his breathing soft and natural, his expression serene yet alert, the embodiment of quiet thought in action. Seeing an opportunity to test his understanding against the master's realization, Shen Hui approached with a question that had been forming in his mind during his own quiet thought practice. The nature of perception during spiritual practice had become a source of great curiosity and confusion for him. "Master," Shen Hui said, bowing respectfully, but speaking with the confidence of someone who believed his question particularly insightful. "When you sit in quiet thought, do you see or not?" To Shen Hui, this seemed like a perfectly reasonable inquiry into the mechanics of awakened awareness. Did awakened consciousness involve special kinds of seeing? Did quiet thought reveal mystical visions or higher perceptions unavailable to ordinary minds? Or did true realization transcend seeing altogether, existing in some pure state beyond sensory experience? What he received in response was completely unexpected. Without warning, the 6th patriarch picked up his wooden teaching stick and struck Shen Hui 3 times in rapid succession, not gently, but with enough force that the blows stung sharply and left the young monk both physically uncomfortable and mentally bewildered. "When I hit you," the patriarch asked with the same calm tone one might use to discuss the weather, "does it hurt or not?" Shen Hui rubbed his smarting shoulders, his mind racing to understand what had just occurred. The question seemed simple enough, yet something about the context made him suspect that a straightforward answer might be inadequate. The physical sensation was undeniable, yet the spiritual implications felt complex. "It both does and does not hurt," he replied carefully, sensing that the master was pointing towards some paradox beyond ordinary logic. "I both see and do not see," the 6th patriarch responded, his words carrying the weight of direct experience rather than philosophical speculation. But Shen Hui's intellect wasn't satisfied with paradox. He needed to understand the mechanics, to categorize and explain this teaching in terms his conceptual mind could grasp. "How can you both see and not see?" he pressed, genuine confusion evident in his voice. "That seems contradictory. Either you see during quiet thought or you don't. How can both be true simultaneously?" The patriarch's response came with the patience of someone who had spent decades helping students move beyond the limitations of thinking in terms of opposites. "What I see," he explained with gentle clarity, "are the waverings and wanderings of my own mind. What I do not see is the right and wrong and good and bad of other people. This is my seeing and not seeing." With these words, the entire teaching crystallized. The master wasn't speaking about mystical visions or transcendent states, but about the fundamental shift in perception that accompanies genuine spiritual maturity. Ancient Buddhist wisdom tells us, the mind is everything. What you think, you become. This teaching relates profoundly to the patriarch's lesson about the nature of awakened seeing. Why do we become confused when spiritual teachings transcend ordinary logic? Zen Buddhism explains that our conceptual mind operates through categories of opposites: seeing or not seeing, pain or no pain, right or wrong. But enlightened awareness doesn't eliminate these experiences. It transforms our relationship to them. The deeper teaching here shows us what authentic spiritual perception actually involves. The patriarch sees his own mental processes clearly, the arising and passing of thoughts, emotions, and reactions. This isn't a mystical power, but the natural result of sustained mindfulness practice. He observes the waverings and wanderings of consciousness without being lost in them. Simultaneously, he doesn't see in the judgmental sense, imposing categories of right and wrong, good and bad onto others' behavior. This non-seeing isn't ignorance, but wisdom, recognizing that such judgments often say more about the observer than the observed. Look deeply at your own patterns of perception. How much of what you think you see in others actually reflects your own mental projections? When someone irritates you, are you seeing their actual behavior clearly, or are you seeing your own triggers and reactions? When someone impresses you, are you recognizing their genuine qualities, or are you seeing your own desires for approval or achievement? This ancient wisdom illuminates the difference between reactive perception and clear seeing. Reactive perception involves our past conditioning, our emotional needs, our judgmental habits. Clear seeing involves awareness that recognizes its own processes while remaining open to what's actually present. Zen Master Dogen taught, to study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. This teaching points to the same insight the patriarch offered. True seeing involves turning attention toward our own mental processes, rather than fixating on external judgments and evaluations. The 3 strikes Shenhui received weren't punishment, but skillful teaching. Physical pain that both does and does not hurt points toward the mystery of conscious experience itself. Pain arises in awareness, is felt fully, yet doesn't define or limit the awareness that experiences it. Similarly, thoughts and emotions arise in consciousness without contaminating its essential clarity. Think about how this teaching might transform your daily experience. Instead of constantly evaluating others' behavior, finding fault, making comparisons, generating opinions, what if you turn that same attention toward observing your own mental reactions? What patterns would you discover in the wanderings and waverings of your own mind? This doesn't mean we become passive or lose our capacity for discernment. Rather, we develop the ability to respond from clarity rather than reactivity. When we see our own judgmental tendencies clearly, we naturally become less caught in them. When we observe our mental projections, we're less likely to mistake them for objective reality. In Zen practice, we learn what's called mirror mind, awareness that reflects whatever arises without being stained or changed by it. This mirror sees everything clearly while maintaining its essential emptiness and openness. Tonight, as you notice your mind categorizing and judging the experiences of your day, can you remember the patriarch's teaching? Can you turn your attention toward the seer rather than constantly evaluating what is seen? Can you discover the freedom that comes from seeing your own mental processes without being enslaved by them? Buddha spoke of this when he said, "You yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection." By learning to see our own mental patterns with compassion rather than judgment, we develop the clarity to see others with equal kindness and understanding. Let us now turn to a tale of a young monk who believed he had failed in his spiritual journey. This is the story of the Golden Wake. At a peaceful temple overlooking a serene mountain lake, a young student sat dejected on the temple steps as the sun began its descent toward the water. His shoulders sagged with the weight of disappointment, and his eyes reflected the heaviness in his heart. For months he had struggled with his studies, unable to grasp the profound teachings that seemed to come so naturally to his fellow monks. "The boat is coming to take me home because I have failed in my studies here at the temple," he said to his teacher, who had quietly approached and sat beside him. "What can I say to my family? They sent me here with such hope, believing I would return as a learned monk who could guide others on the path." The old teacher gazed out at the lake where a small wooden boat was making its way slowly across the still water. The setting sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber. "Say that you did your best, and that is as much as anyone can do," he answered gently, his voice carrying the wisdom of many years. "But I wanted to be a famous monk and teach others," the boy replied, his voice thick with disappointment. "I dreamed of leading quiet thought sessions, of having students seek my guidance, of making a real difference in the world." "You can," the teacher said simply. "How?" asked the sad boy, looking at his teacher with confusion. "I couldn't even memorize the basic teachings. I fell asleep during quiet thought. I failed at everything that matters." The teacher smiled and pointed toward the water. "Live from your heart. I will show you. Do you see that boat making its way across the lake, with the sun setting behind it?" "Yes," the boy replied, following his teacher's gaze. "Do you see its wake spreading across the lake? See how the boat looks like the point of a golden triangle as the wake fans out from its front?" The boy squinted, trying to see what his teacher described. "Sort of," said the teacher patiently. "That boat is you as you leave the temple. The lake is your life. The wake is the effect that you will have on the world. Each ripple triggers another ripple, which triggers another. By constantly striving to live as wise and loving a life as you can teach the path of love to everyone you meet, simply by being yourself. A few of these people will pass on your good example to others. Thus, the expanding golden wake of good works begets other good works. Most important, notice how each ripple catches the sun and bounces its light back to heaven." The boy watched in wonder as the simple boat continued its journey, the wake indeed forming an ever-widening triangle of light upon the water. Each small wave caught the golden sunlight and reflected it back toward the sky in countless sparkling points. "Would you come home with me and explain all of this to my father?" asked the boy, hope beginning to kindle in his voice. Buddha's wisdom reminds us, a candle loses nothing by lighting another candle. The deeper teaching here shows us that influence spreads not through grand gestures or perfect knowledge, but through the simple authenticity of a heart committed to goodness. Why do we believe that only formal credentials or recognized achievements qualify us to make a meaningful impact? Zen Buddhism points to our attachment to external praise and our misunderstanding of how wisdom actually transmits from person to person. We imagine that teaching requires a podium, a title, or a certificate, when in reality, the most profound lessons are shared through the quality of our presence and the integrity of our actions. Think about how often throughout your day you encounter people who touch your life not through their expertise, but through their kindness, their patience, or their simple human warmth. The grocery store clerk who greets you with genuine care, the stranger who offers directions with a smile, the friend who listens without judging. These people create ripples that extend far beyond their awareness. In Zen practice, we learn what might be called unconscious teaching. This is the natural transmission that occurs when we align our actions with our deepest values. Like the boat on the lake, we may not see our wake, but it spreads inevitably behind us, touching shores we never knew existed. The Buddha said, "Thousands of candles can be lighted from a single candle, and the life of the candle will not be shortened. Happiness never decreases by being shared." Each moment of authentic living becomes a teaching. Each act of compassion creates ripples. Each choice to respond with wisdom rather than reacting sends light back toward heaven. Tonight, as you reflect on your own journey, can you see the golden wake you're already creating? Perhaps it's in the patience you show a difficult family member, the encouragement you offer a struggling colleague, or the simple presence you bring to everyday encounters. The light you reflect may be illuminating paths you've never imagined. Let us now turn to a story about the fundamental truth that governs all experience. This is the teaching of the meditation student and the wise reminder. A young student had been practicing quiet thought for several months with sincere dedication. Each morning and evening, he would sit quietly on his cushion, close his eyes, and attempt to follow the breathing techniques his teacher had shown him. Some days, the practice felt natural and peaceful. But recently, he had been struggling with what seemed like constant distraction and discomfort. On this particular morning, he could barely sit still for 5 minutes before frustration overwhelmed him. His mind raced with thoughts about work, relationships, and a dozen trivial concerns. His legs ached from sitting in an unfamiliar position, and despite his best efforts to focus on his breath, he found himself constantly pulled away by mental chatter and physical restlessness. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, he gave up on his practice and sought out his quiet thought teacher. He found the elderly monk tending a small garden behind the quiet thought hall, peacefully pulling weeds in the early morning sunlight. "Teacher," the student said, his voice heavy with discouragement and self-criticism, "my quiet thought is horrible. I can't focus on anything. I feel so distracted and scattered. My legs ache constantly, and I keep falling asleep when I'm not distracted. Everything about my practice feels wrong. It's just horrible." The teacher looked up from his gardening, soil still clinging to his weathered hands, and met the student's frustrated gaze with calm, knowing eyes. He listened to the young man's long list of complaints without judging or surprise, as if he had heard these exact same words countless times before. "It will pass," the teacher said matter-of-factly, then returned to his weeding, as if nothing unusual had occurred. The student stood there for a moment, somewhat taken aback by the shortness and seeming dismissiveness of the response. He had expected detailed advice, perhaps some new technique, or at least some reassurance about his difficulties. Instead, he received just 3 simple words. Feeling somewhat unsatisfied, but having nothing more to say, he returned to his room to contemplate this cryptic guidance. Over the following days, the student continued his practice despite his frustrations. Gradually, something began to shift. The intense distraction started to subside. His body adjusted to the sitting position, and moments of genuine peace began to emerge between the chaos of thoughts. By the end of the week, his quiet thought had transformed completely. Excited by this positive change, he once again sought out his teacher, this time finding him sweeping leaves from the temple courtyard. The student's face glowed with enthusiasm and relief. "Teacher," he exclaimed, "my quiet thought is wonderful now. I feel so aware, so peaceful, so alive during my practice. My mind is clear, my body is comfortable, and I am experiencing the most beautiful states of consciousness. Everything about my quiet thought is just wonderful." The teacher paused in his sweeping, looked at the student with the same calm expression he had worn the week before, and gave exactly the same response. "It will pass." This time, the student heard the deeper teaching. His excitement about his wonderful quiet thought began to transform into something subtler, not disappointment, but understanding. He realized that his teacher was pointing to something fundamental about the nature of all experience, not just quiet thought. Buddha's wisdom tells us, "This too shall pass." The heart of this lesson lies in understanding the temporary nature of all things, both pleasant and unpleasant, both the experiences we hold on to and those we try to escape. Why do we struggle so intensely with the changing nature of our experience? Zen Buddhism reveals that much of our suffering comes from our resistance to impermanence, our desperate attempts to hold on to pleasant states, and our equally desperate attempts to escape unpleasant ones. We wear ourselves out trying to control what is essentially uncontrollable. The student's quiet thought experiences, both horrible and wonderful, were equally temporary. His teacher's consistent response pointed to a deeper stability that exists beneath the constantly changing surface of experience. This isn't the stability of unchanging conditions, but the stability of awareness itself, the space in which all changing experiences arise and pass away. Think about your own relationship with the ups and downs of daily life. How much energy do you spend trying to make permanent good moods, successful periods, or comfortable circumstances? How much resistance do you feel toward difficult emotions, challenging phases, or uncomfortable situations? Both the holding on and the resistance create unnecessary suffering. In Zen practice, we learn to develop what might be called calmness with impermanence. This doesn't mean becoming indifferent to our experiences or not caring about results. Rather, it means developing the capacity to remain centered and responsive, regardless of whether current circumstances are pleasant or unpleasant. The teacher's repeated phrase, "It will pass," contains both comfort and challenge. It offers comfort during difficult times by reminding us that no painful state lasts forever. It challenges us during pleasant times by preventing us from building our identity around temporary successes or peak experiences. Zen master Suzuki Roshi taught, "Each of you is perfect the way you are, and you can use a little improvement." This paradox points to the same truth the quiet thought teacher was sharing. We can fully appreciate and engage with our current experience while simultaneously holding it lightly, knowing it will inevitably change. Look deeply at your own patterns of attachment and aversion, liking and disliking. Where in your life are you trying to make permanent what is naturally temporary? Where are you wearing yourself out fighting against conditions that will shift on their own if you simply allow them to run their natural course? The Buddha said, "All things that are put together are temporary. Strive on with diligence." This teaching invites us to pour ourselves wholeheartedly into life while simultaneously holding all outcomes lightly. We can care deeply about our practice, our relationships, our work, and our growth, while remembering that all forms and experiences are temporary visitors in the space of awareness. This understanding transforms how we relate to both success and failure, both pleasure and pain. Instead of being thrown around by the inevitable fluctuations of life, we can find our stability in the awareness that remains constant while everything else changes. Tonight, as you notice whatever states of mind and body are present, whether comfortable or uncomfortable, pleasant or unpleasant, clear or confused, can you remember the quiet thought teacher's simple wisdom? Can you hold your current experience fully while simultaneously knowing that it, like everything else, will pass? As the Buddha observed, just as the great ocean has one taste, the taste of salt, so also this teaching has one taste, the taste of freedom. The taste of freedom is found not in achieving permanent pleasant states, but in discovering the freedom that comes from dancing gracefully with the ever-changing nature of existence itself. Now let us explore a story about the difference between superficial understanding and lived wisdom. This is the tale of following the stream, in the heart of a vast wilderness where towering pines stretch toward endless sky. Two city dwellers found themselves completely lost. They had ventured into the high timber for what was supposed to be a simple day hike, but overconfidence and poor preparation had led them far from any familiar trail. For a day and a night, they wandered through the dense forest, their anxiety growing with each passing hour. The comfortable urban world they knew seemed impossibly distant. Every tree looked the same. Every path led to another confusing intersection, and their sense of direction had completely abandoned them. Just as panic was beginning to set in, they stumbled upon an old hermit sitting peacefully beside a small clearing. His weathered face spoke of years spent in solitude, and his calm presence offered immediate comfort to the desperate travelers. "How do we find our way back to civilization?" they asked urgently, their voices carrying the desperation of people who had exhausted their own resources. The hermit looked at them with kind eyes that seemed to see more than their immediate predicament. "I could tell you," he replied thoughtfully, "but you'd still get lost." The two men exchanged confused glances. This wasn't the straightforward directions they had hoped for. "What should we do?" they asked, their frustration evident. "Go with the flow. the hermit answered simply. I beg your pardon, one of them responded, clearly expecting something more practical and specific. The hermit smiled and pointed toward a small stream that bubbled cheerfully through the clearing. Go with the flow. You see that stream over there? Just follow it. Streams go into creeks, and creeks go into rivers, and rivers go through towns. Also, along the way, you'll have water to drink and berries to eat. This practical advice made immediate sense to the lost travelers. Following water downstream was indeed a reliable way to find human settlements, and the stream would provide essential resources they needed for survival during their journey. But one of the men, perhaps having heard spiritual teachings before, asked a deeper question. Is that what Zen people mean when they say go with the flow? The hermit paused for a moment, considering this question with the same careful attention he had given their practical need for directions. Yes and no, he replied enigmatically, and then continued along his way, leaving the two men to find their own understanding of his words. The Buddha once said, "If you understand, things are just as they are. If you do not understand, things are just as they are." This teaching points to the layered nature of wisdom that the hermit embodied in his response to the lost travelers. The deeper teaching here shows us how authentic spiritual guidance operates on multiple levels simultaneously. The hermit's advice was both completely practical and profoundly metaphorical. On the surface level, following the stream was simply good wilderness survival strategy. On a deeper level, it represented the entire approach to living that Zen encourages. Why did the hermit say the travelers would still get lost, even if he gave them directions? This points to a fundamental truth about the difference between receiving information and developing wisdom. External directions can guide us temporarily, but they don't develop our inner capacity for navigation. Real wisdom involves learning to read the natural signs and flow with the underlying currents of life itself. Think about how this applies to our spiritual seeking. We often approach teachers and teachings looking for specific directions. Tell me exactly what to do to become enlightened. Give me the precise quiet thought technique that will solve my problems. But this approach, while understandable, misses the deeper point. True spiritual guidance doesn't provide a map, but teaches us how to read the territory. It doesn't give us someone else's answers, but helps us develop the capacity to find our own. Like the stream that naturally knows its way to the ocean, we each have an innate wisdom that can guide us if we learn to trust and follow it. The phrase "go with the flow" has become so common in popular culture that it's almost lost its meaning, often interpreted as passively giving up or lack of direction. But the hermit's yes and no response points to a more nuanced understanding. True flowing isn't about drifting aimlessly, but about aligning our efforts with the natural currents of wisdom and compassion. The stream represents the Tao, the natural way that underlies all existence. When we align ourselves with this deeper flow, our actions become effortless and effective. We stop pushing against reality and learn to work with the grain of existence rather than against it. But this requires developing a different kind of intelligence than our usual problem-solving mind. The travelers wanted explicit directions because that's how the rational mind works, through clear, step-by-step instructions. But the deeper intelligence the hermit was pointing toward operates more like intuition, sensing the right direction moment by moment, rather than following a predetermined plan. This is why contemplative traditions emphasize present moment awareness. The stream doesn't need to know where the ocean is. It simply flows in the direction that feels natural right now. Similarly, when we develop moment-to-moment mindfulness, we can sense the appropriate response to each situation without needing to figure out the entire journey in advance. Tonight, as you navigate the complexities of your own life, can you sense the streams of natural wisdom flowing beneath the surface of your daily concerns? What would it mean to trust that deeper current while still attending responsibly to practical necessities? Buddha's wisdom reminds us, thousands of candles can be lighted from a single candle, and the life of the candle will not be shortened. The hermit's guidance was like lighting a candle in the traveller's minds, providing not just directions, but a way of approaching life that could serve them in countless future situations. Let us now turn to a tale about the nature of faith and self-doubt. This is the story of the wishing tree. A poor man walked slowly through a dense forest, his shoulders heavy with worry. Bills unpaid, relationships strained, dreams put off. Each step seemed to echo with the weight of his many troubles. The canopy above filtered the sunlight into gentle patterns on the forest floor. But he noticed none of this beauty. His mind churned endlessly through his problems, each thought leading to another worry, another reason why his life felt so difficult. Exhausted from walking and thinking, he stopped to rest against what appeared to be an ordinary tree. Its trunk was wide and welcoming, its bark smooth against his back. As he leaned there, catching his breath, he realized how thirsty he had become. "I wish I had something to drink," he murmured to himself. Instantly, as if materializing from thin air, a cup of cool, clear water appeared in his hand. He stared at it in disbelief, turning the cup this way and that, examining it for some trick or illusion. The water looked pure, inviting. Tentatively, he brought it to his lips and drank. It was the most refreshing water he had ever tasted, cool and sweet, exactly what his parched throat needed. "That was strange," he said aloud, but his stomach chose that moment to growl with hunger. Almost without thinking, he wished for food. A simple but nourishing meal appeared before him on a wooden plate. Fresh bread, ripe fruit, and vegetables that looked as if they had just been harvested. The aroma made his mouth water. He ate slowly, marveling at each bite. "My wishes are being granted," he whispered in amazement. The realization sent a thrill through his entire body. "Well then," he said with growing excitement, "I wish for a beautiful home of my own." Before his eyes, in the meadow just beyond the tree, a magnificent house materialized. It was everything he had ever dreamed of. Spacious rooms filled with light, comfortable furnishings, gardens blooming with flowers. His heart raced with joy as he stood and approached his new home. "If I have such a house," he reasoned, "I'll need help to maintain it." He wished for servants, and immediately several kind-faced people appeared, bowing respectfully and asking how they might serve him. The man laughed with delight, hardly believing his incredible fortune. "And what good is a beautiful home without someone special to share it with?" he wondered aloud. He wished for a beautiful, loving, intelligent woman to be his companion. A radiant woman appeared beside him, her eyes warm with affection, her smile gentle and knowing. But as she took his hand, something shifted in the man's mind. The rational voice that had whispered doubts throughout his life suddenly grew louder. "Wait a minute," he said, stepping back from the woman. "This is ridiculous. I'm not this lucky. Things like this don't happen to people like me. This can't be real." As the words left his mouth, everything began to fade. The woman's loving smile dissolved first, then the servants, then the beautiful house, and finally, even the simple meal he had enjoyed. He found himself alone again, leaning against what now seemed like an ordinary tree with nothing but his original troubles for company. He shook his head knowingly. "I knew it," he muttered and walked away through the forest. His mind immediately returning to the familiar patterns of worry and complaint that had occupied him before. Buddha's wisdom reminds us, we are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world. The heart of this lesson lies in understanding the creative power of belief and the self-sabotaging nature of doubt. Why do we so readily dismiss the good that comes into our lives? Zen Buddhism points to a deeply conditioned pattern in the human mind, the tendency to trust our limitations more than our possibilities. We become so familiar with struggle, so identified with our problems, that abundance feels foreign, even threatening to our sense of self. Think about how often throughout your day you might receive unexpected kindness, notice surprising beauty, or encounter opportunities that could transform your circumstances? How quickly do you dismiss these gifts as coincidence, luck, or too good to be true? This automatic doubt often causes us to literally walk away from the very blessings we've been seeking. The wishing tree represents the responsive universe that Zen teaches us about, reality that mirrors back our deepest beliefs about what we deserve and what's possible. When we approach life with trust and openness, we often discover resources and opportunities that were always available but previously invisible to us. When we approach with cynicism and self-doubt, these same possibilities seem to vanish. The man in the story had access to everything he needed, but his training told him that someone like him couldn't possibly be worthy of such gifts. His belief in his own limitations became more powerful than the evidence of his senses. This is the tragedy of self-doubt. It causes us to abandon the very solutions to our problems. Zen teacher Suzuki Roshi said, "Each of you is perfect the way you are, and you can use a little improvement." This paradox points to the balance between accepting our inherent worthiness while remaining open to growth. The man under the tree couldn't hold both truths simultaneously, that he was worthy of good things and that positive change was possible in his life. In our modern context, we encounter wishing trees constantly, the colleague who offers genuine friendship, but we assume they have ulterior motives. The job opportunity that seems perfect, but we convince ourselves we're not qualified. The romantic relationship that feels too good to be true, so we sabotage it before it can disappoint us. Each time we choose familiar limitation over unfamiliar possibility, we walk away from our own wishing tree. The Buddha taught, doubt everything, find your own light. But there's a crucial distinction between the doubt that leads to wisdom and the doubt that leads to self-defeat. Wise doubt questions assumptions and seeks truth. Self-defeating doubt assumes the worst about ourselves and our possibilities, then treats these assumptions as facts. Zen practice invites us to notice when we're dismissing good fortune, abundance, or love simply because it doesn't match our habitual story about ourselves. Can we remain open to the possibility that we might be more deserving, more capable, more lovable than our training suggests? Tonight, as you reflect on the day's experiences, can you identify moments when you might have walked away from your own wishing tree? Perhaps a compliment you dismissed, an opportunity you assumed wasn't meant for you, or a moment of joy you cut short because it felt too good to last. What would it mean to trust in your worthiness, to receive life's gifts? As the Buddha observed, thousands of candles can be lighted from a single candle, and the life of the candle will not be shortened. Happiness never decreases by being shared. The wishing tree's magic isn't diminished by granting wishes. It's fulfilled by them, and our capacity to receive life's blessings isn't diminished by accepting them. It's expanded. Let us now turn to a story about the most profound spiritual truth hiding in the most obvious place. This is the dialogue between Yoshu and Nansen about the ordinary mind. In a quiet mountain temple, where morning mist drifted between ancient pine trees and the sound of temple bells echoed across distant valleys, two masters engaged in a conversation that would illuminate the very heart of Zen understanding. Joshu, despite his own considerable wisdom and years of practice, approached his teacher Nansen with the earnestness of a sincere student seeking to understand the deepest mysteries of existence. The two men sat facing each other in the temple's quiet thought hall, where countless seekers before them had wrestled with the same fundamental questions about the nature of awakening. Joshu's inquiry came from a place of genuine perplexity. After years of intensive practice, quiet thought, and study, he still felt uncertain about the very foundation of the spiritual path. "Master," Joshu began with characteristic directness, "what exactly is the way? With all our practices and teachings, what are we ultimately seeking?" Nansen's response was immediate and surprisingly simple. "Ordinary mind is the way," he replied, as if stating the most obvious fact in the world. This answer clearly puzzled Joshu, who had expected something more secret, more complex, more removed from everyday experience. If ordinary mind is the way, he pressed further, then should we direct ourselves toward cultivating it? Should we make it our spiritual goal? Nansen shook his head gently. If you direct yourself toward it, you immediately go away from it, he explained. The very effort to attain ordinary mind makes it extraordinary and therefore no longer ordinary. Now, Joshu found himself in what seemed like an impossible logical bind. But Master, if we don't try to cultivate or attain anything, how can we ever know that this ordinary mind is actually the way? How can we recognize it without some form of practice or effort? Nansen's final response cut through all philosophical complexity with razor-sharp clarity. The way does not belong to knowing or not knowing. Knowing turns the way into a concept, an object of understanding, which is illusion. Not knowing turns it into blankness, which misses its vibrant presence. If you truly realize the way without doubt, it becomes like the great void, so vast and boundless that it contains everything. How then could there be any distinction between right and wrong, sacred and mundane, ordinary and extraordinary? At these words, something shifted fundamentally in Joshu's understanding. The seeking mind that had been grasping for answers suddenly relaxed, and he experienced a moment of complete clarity. Not the clarity of understanding something new, but the clarity of recognizing what had been present all along. Buddha's wisdom reminds us there is nothing to seek and nothing to find. Everything is already here. The heart of this lesson lies in recognizing that what we seek through spiritual practice is not some special state of consciousness, but rather the ordinary awareness that is reading these words right now. Why do we struggle to accept that ordinary mind is the way? Zen Buddhism points to our deep training that spiritual truth must be extraordinary, mystical, or dramatically different from our everyday experience. We imagine enlightenment as a permanent state of bliss, cosmic consciousness, or supernatural abilities, when in reality it is simply the natural state of awareness without the overlay of seeking and striving. Our spiritual seeking often becomes its own obstacle. Like a person frantically searching for glasses while wearing them, we wear ourselves out looking for something we already possess. The very effort to attain a special spiritual state creates the sense of separation between seeker and sought, between the ordinary self and some idealized awakened self. Think about how your own mind works in this very moment. Thoughts arise and pass away. Sensations appear in your body. Sounds reach your ears. Emotions flow through your awareness. This natural functioning of consciousness without any special effort or concentration is what Nansen calls ordinary mind. It is already enlightened, not because it achieves some particular state, but because it is the very space in which all states appear and dissolve. Zen master Huangbo taught, "Your everyday mind, that is the way." Just like now, without seeking anything, without grasping after the fruits of Zen, just this mind that thinks and feels and perceives, this is Buddha. This ordinariness is precisely what makes it so difficult to recognize. We keep looking past it for something more impressive. The great void that Nansen mentions is not empty space, but rather the spacious awareness in which all experiences arise. Like the sky that remains unchanged, whether filled with clouds or clear. This awareness remains constant through all the changing contents of experience. Joy and sorrow, clarity and confusion, peace and agitation, all appear and disappear within this unchanging background of ordinary awareness. This understanding revolutionizes our approach to spiritual practice. Instead of trying to achieve some special state, we learn to recognize the awareness that is already present. Instead of seeking to transcend ordinary experience, we discover the extraordinary nature of ordinariness itself. The sound of rain becomes as sacred as temple bells. Washing dishes becomes as profound as formal quiet thought. In Japanese art, there is a concept called wabi-sabi. finding beauty in imperfection and impermanence. This appreciation for the ordinary and imperfect reflects the same understanding that Nansen points toward. The way is not found in perfected states, but in the natural flow of life exactly as it is. Tonight, as you experience the simple fact of being aware of these words, aware of your breathing, aware of the sounds around you, can you recognize this ordinary awareness as what you have been seeking all along? Can you relax the effort to become something other than what you already are? As the Buddha taught, peace comes from within. Do not seek it without. The way is not a destination to reach, but the very ground you are already standing on. In accepting your ordinary mind as Buddha mind, you discover that the spiritual journey was never about going somewhere else, but about recognizing where you have always been. Tonight, as we gently draw our time together to a close, can you feel how the calm that settled over you isn't something you had to chase or create? It was already here, waiting patiently beneath the surface of your everyday awareness, ready to welcome you home whenever you pause long enough to notice. The Buddha once said, "What we think we become." As these words settle in, notice how the peace you're experiencing right now doesn't rely on perfect conditions or flawless quiet thought. It springs naturally from your own capacity to be present, available to you in any moment you choose to turn inward. Each story we've shared tonight has woven together a simple but powerful understanding that our struggles often soften when we stop fighting so hard. That freedom comes not from getting what we want, but from releasing our tight hold on outcomes. And that clarity emerges when we see through the mental noise that usually clouds our vision. Don't worry if your thoughts wandered during our time together, or if you felt restless at moments. The insights you've encountered tonight have already taken root, becoming part of your inner landscape in ways you may not even realize yet. They'll be there when you need them, like trusted friends waiting in the wings. As you transition from this peaceful pause back into your regular life, remember that what you've experienced here travels with you. The stories may fade, but the deeper understanding they've awakened remains. This sense of ease, this gentle clarity, it's yours to return to whenever life feels overwhelming or uncertain. May this peace stay close to you, a steady companion through whatever tomorrow brings. Thank you for joining us on this journey.